And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I want to live underground. Mm-hmm. And there's a good reason for that, because the Copper Queen's mine in Bisbee is deep, deep underground. And there's some very interesting secrets associated with this. And it's interesting because I've touched on this, but tonight we're going to go so deep into the special episode, which is X-Series 191. It's Atlantis, Arizona, Lapis, Cayce TUAOI FireStone mystery revealed. And we're going to go deep tonight to show a little-known chapter of Edgar Cayce's life when he takes off to Arizona for a month, which was highly unusual in his circumstances, and the reasons he went and what he discovered when he got there, including the highly unusual apparitions that followed him during the trip, and how it all relates to an ancient Atlantean power source called TUAOI, which Cayce mentioned in a series of readings for an individual named Mitchell Hastings. And Mitchell Hastings is going to be kind of our mystery figure for the evening, as there's a lot of very unusual things around Mr. Hastings we're going to get into tonight. I also want to remind you that we're going to take your questions in the second half of tonight's program, and basically try to keep the questions on topic, but we're going to be going deep on this Atlantis subject tonight to give you the idea, and how Lapis, the stone, the power stone of the Egyptians and the Atlanteans, became such a central force in their mystical spiritual life. And what is the true Lapis, according to Edgar Cayce? All of that figures in tonight with our huge bonanza X-Series 191. So when you ask questions, you can actually ask them anytime during the program. She's going to put them together for the second half. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
CC says, I've got my pockets full of lapis for the show. And Bella Clark says, I pulled my Lapis O2 sitting here in front of me.
Oh, wow. Incredible. Well, I can tell you that for years, off and on, I've worn lapis, and I don't really wear any stones these days, but in the past, I know it was quite an attunement device. One of the interesting things that I mentioned briefly at the end of the last episode, announcing this one, is that Cayce was very, if you get deep into the questions, and this is what you want to do, because a lot of the readings, the books are good, but they have to be kind of, the people have to grab the quote and put it in there, and that's the Cayce reading. But if you read the whole reading, you get a little bit more of the heft of what he was putting across. But in one of those readings, when he was asked about the lapis, he said, better if it's an unpolished stone, the emanations work better. And there's a whole kind of psychic vibration aspect associated with this. And that, for me, becomes very interesting, because when you polish the stone, of course, it's certainly easier to wear and everything else. But apparently it loses a little something, according to the Sleeping Prophet. And we're going to get into that tonight. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com before we start and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter, and it keeps us in touch with each other through all the crazy censorship and everything else that we see with our channel and everything on social media. That's the direct pipeline that lets you know about the incredible shows that we have coming up for you. Documentaries, of course, the companion documentary to this episode is right in the description, and that's part of our docuseries, which is the CRAZE and the HOTZONE, Hacking Atlantis, going deep in that production. And part 2 of that we are shooting, and we will be coming out with that probably sometime in May. There's incredible interviews coming up for you, and X-Series episodes that are going to blow your mind. It's all there in the newsletter, so stand up and be counted. Make sure that you go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for that newsletter. How's everything else out there?
Everybody's in a fantastic mood.
Well, see, sometimes you get that Friday vibe just right. And it was kind of a weird week for the general kind of news cycle, and kind of a weird week for independent media, as you had really people, kind of crashing and burning all over the place. And I think it's becoming more and more I don't know. People are just starting to figure out that there's the mainstream media that the independent media was there to kind of push back against. But what happened was the independent media got hijacked by a lot of financial interests. And so now you have paid media 1 or paid media 2. And, the kind of thing that I have stressed is that we need a very potent form of journalism, dark journalism, to get through all that. And what I see is a lot of the independent stuff really being manipulated by the Peter Thiel types in the background. And so that's going to spell a third wave of people doing this. And it's funny because one of the things that I noticed when I was going through some of the various Fox personalities who've moved into the independent space, Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, and people like that. Megyn Kelly has 6 different producers for her show.
That's incredible.
Isn't that remarkable?
Mm-hmm.
And on every episode of the Tucker Carlson show, there are 45 people working on that. So you can see, there is a difference there. And I even like some of what those people do. It's not the point. It's just independent media, it comes from an independent place. So it's not calculating in that sense. So some of these things are coming up against the mainstream media, but they're replacing it with the same kind of, setup in the sense that these aren't really independent so much
Well, they're
as they
sort
are.
of semi-corporate.
Yeah, they're semi-corporate. They come out of corporate. The money that's paying for it's corporate. So that's a very different thing when you get an independent who is working with a subscriber base and is 100%, the audience funds it. And there's nothing wrong with advertising and all the rest. I'm just saying it's becoming very obvious that there are multiple levels of these things. And so we need to identify it as such, because the things that were going on this week, there are weird money grabs going on all over the place, and everybody is trying to get controversies going in order to get, bigger numbers or whatever it happens to be. And it's looking pretty bad. And I don't like to point out researchers so much, but the Candace Owens thing is it's become a travesty. It's one of the worst. And now she's out there and she's doing every show defending Tate, our favorite pimp, who Ron DeSantis wants to deport from Florida. And you can't blame him. Romania sent the guy over here. There's all kinds of weird things going on like that, but we're not going to make this guy, Rosa Parks or something. Let's get real. This is just a pimp opportunist, cam girl guy. So, let's at least be real about that. And I think there's a real problem going on the conservative side of independent media that needs to be addressed if you want it to be actual media and not just somebody's entertainment show. So there's a lot of problems, and I think you're going to see a big shakeup and shakeout in relation to this, which is maybe too much money during the Trump campaign got into this other side of things. It's very interesting because I'm finding a lot of those people finding themselves on the wrong side of many of Trump's policies as well, which is odd. The whole thing is just, try some coherence here once in a while, fellas. One of the things I find interesting is that Trump has been coming out with a number of different statements around Ukraine, Iran, and other things that tell me that there's a great, heavy focus on foreign policy going on. And, Trump is really, he's halfway through the 100 days. And what you need to do is let that whole thing play out. I noticed a lot of people going after, Pam Bondi or Cash or whatever, saying, hey, you're not releasing things fast enough, whatever. They have the 100 days to do it. What they should do, though, I think there's been an overemphasis on this Epstein thing because, and I can show you how it works, but basically the JFK records were the central records. They were the core thing in the executive order to get out. And there's a whole framework for doing it because the records are 61 years old. It would be great to get the actual Epstein list, but that's not in those court records. That's the problem. That's in the Maxwell case. So a lot of those people that are arguing this stuff back and forth, it doesn't cut to what we're really talking about, which is there's a major opportunity around this secret that's been kept on the JFK files, and that relates to aerospace and will open up that whole thing up if it's done properly. So we need more of that. and less of the showboating stuff with people. And it's a weird thing too, where you're finding even big league channels and things saying that they have the Epstein file or whatever when the stuff hasn't been released because they just want people to tune in. So there's a lot of unethical behavior, which always happens in corporate media, but on the independent side, you hope for something, a little more integrity. I guess ethical guardrail would be a good term for it. And we're used to it with the UFO file because the CIA has so badly infiltrated that. And what's funny about all that is apparently Lou Elizondo is making an appearance up here. Our old pal Lou is coming up here and bringing his counterintelligence sideshow. Here's the amazing thing. Since his book came out, Imminent, which I call Imminent BS, that book, the stretch of time, let's say that came out in like September, October, and now suddenly it's become very uncool to go to these counterintelligence whistleblowers. It's starting to crack. People are starting to figure it out. Some of those big shows, they're starting to realize that it's a late realization. They're like 5 years behind the show, but it is a fantastic thing to be watching, and people are starting to catch on that you don't go to top CIA counterintelligence officials for truth on the UFO file. So we're going to see more of that wave, but people are starting to come into their own on this. This is fantastic because the thing that they've been playing since 2017, the New York Times article, Jim Semivan, Elizondo, Chris Mellon, that whole deal, they've been pushing for it. They have the Spielberg movie coming out next year. They have this Age of Disclosure thing, which is going into mainstream theaters, which, has Elizondo, Mellon, and all those people doing all the counterintelligence points. And it's interesting because the producer and director of that movie is Lou Elizondo's agent. So, in terms of favoritism, how are you going to question your own client properly? I guess that becomes the question. So this guy, Farah, who's the director, is just completely doing favoritism in his project there, but they're going to push it. They have a lot of money behind that. They have a lot of money behind the Spielberg thing. But in between, something has happened. The cracks are now apparent, and we're starting to see people are picking up that the UFO file should not be in the hands of these CIA whistleblowers. And I think people have become tired of the whistleblower thing. I remember when Luna was talking about her committee there, the DCLOS committee, and I hope that they do get some things out and on the record. But one of the things that she put across was that this time, instead of getting whistleblowers for the UFO committee, we want to have evidence. Well, that's exactly what we've been talking about here for the past couple of years, getting evidence on the record about the thing, and not these counterintelligence whistleblowers who, in fact, because they are counterintelligence, are some of the best liars on the planet. That's the last place you go for any real answers. And I've always been very fond of regular citizens when it comes to the UFO file. Less and less of intelligence and military people with a stake in this. And, and the military is preferable to the intelligence end. The intelligence end, forget it. It's completely a whitewash, and they have a spin, and that spin is the UFO threat. That's the heart of it. And now they're trying to spin it a little bit with the, psionics and things like that, because they realize that the wave that people are interested in doesn't have anything to do with the whole nuts and bolts aliens attack thing. And so they're trying to come in through this other angle. And in fact, remember that there's a genuine UFO file and a genuine psychic interaction aspect of it. We just did a show on that. And so it has to be remembered that these people are constantly in imitation mode. And that's what intelligence people do, is they act like a mirror. And, when you call them out on something, what they do is just reverse. They take your exact words and call you the same thing. Because intelligence people don't have any creativity. It's all a shtick, as it were. So that's very important for us to keep in mind with all of the disclosures which are coming up for this year. And I do think that panel that Luna is running could net some results if they get serious. I think they started off on the wrong foot in a sense because, she said, we're going to go find some people who were actually alive during the JFK assassination. You don't need to do that. You have committees that met in 1979. Those records are locked up until 2040. You have committees that met for the ARRB. Those records are locked up till 2045. That was in the 90s. Those things and those records and those people would be much better to seek out. There's no reason, we've already had the actual testimony for years on the record. So rehashing that isn't going to do anything. What you want to do is cut to the core of how it was covered up by the government at that time, reveal those records through those committees. There's one committee back there called the Pike Commission. And this is fun to look up. 1976, when they were still in the process of figuring out and exploring what the CIA had been up to in terms of assassinations. And those records are sealed till 2050. Well, that's 75 years of hiding things. That's the longest of all of them, I believe. And so the Pike Commission records would be something very important to go after, the things that were locked up by the Church Committee and also the Rockefeller Commission. All of that could be explosive on the Kennedy side and getting into the heart of these things. That's how you get something good. I do hear that the committee, Luna's committee and Pam Bondi had a meeting. So now you get the CIA director involved, Gabbard, the DNI there, and then the CIA director, Radcliffe. That whole thing can turn, and then the records could come out. That could be a real earthquake on the deep state side. Mm-hmm. Unbelievable. So we'll be shooting for that. And as far as I'm concerned, I know there's other records to contend with, the Epstein case, the MLK case, and the RFK, and they talk about releasing and doing this thing. The JFK records have been hidden by this government for 61 years. Those should be the focus, and they can be the earthquake that everything else stems off of. And so let's not lose the real kind of prize in the middle of all this as we're going along. And all of it should come out, of course, but let's not lose that focus. I feel like there's a distraction operation going on in the works, as it were. Actually, tonight you are watching the Dark Journalist X series. It is episode 191. This is the Atlantis, Arizona Lapis Cayce TUAOI FireStone mystery. I'm going to show how all that makes sense and how Atlantis apparently had a habit, the Atlanteans, of going and mining in Arizona and mining this very important blue stone. And that's where we get all of the tales of the TUAOI, as it were, and that immense power station that ran the globe some 50, 60, maybe 100,000 years ago. It goes very far back. One of the only dates that we got out of Cayce for a worldwide meeting of these Atlanteans with all these other nations is 50,722, because they wanted to put out this massive death ray to get rid of the gigantic beasts that sound like dinosaurs. But this is 50,000 BC. And they were going to send it out from these different power stations and do that. And this activity, because it was unintentionally set too high, caused one of the first major earthquakes that split the islands into three. And from there, it only got worse through the actions of the group, the Sons of Belial. Well, what if one of those Sons of Belial reincarnated and was now a good guy and had all that knowledge about the TUAOI stone and the power grid and all the rest of it and wanted to rectify the situation? Well, that might give us the life story of T. Mitchell Hastings. And his relationship with Cayce is going to come up here tonight. Very important for those who understand the real deep psychic connection around this episode and this issue. So that's where we're going to open tonight. Before I get into anything else.
Sorry, I'm having some issues. Now is not a good moment.
Oh, excellent.
We have a little
issues.
uppityness.
Issues are all right. That's all right. You know where it's at, and you know how to take care of them. And I'm fond of saying that if there are any 3-letter agency people using 4-letter words in the chat, you get a 5-star general here to deal with. Okay. I wanted to read a couple of things right off the bat. And of course, I just want to set up that when we talk about Atlantis, one of the things that's happened over the past 20 years or so, maybe even longer, is that people have gotten away on the research side from where Plato indicated Atlantis was, which was between the Straits of Hercules on one side, which is the Mediterranean, and on the other side, the Gulf of Mexico. All the mystery schools have said this. Plato indicated it. It's all there. So they've been moving it. So they have Atlantis in South America, Atlantis into Antarctica, Atlantis in the Sahara. What you're actually getting is after the islands split, and especially when Atlantis was going down, there was an egress. And so they carried with them the civilization to Yucatan. They carried with them the civilization to Peru. They carried with them the civilization to Egypt and became the legacy cultures of those various places. And then you had all those stories associated with the flood and all the rest of it. And that's the modern wave. Remember, we're talking about a civilization that lasted 250,000 years. So you have many different phases during that period. But so when we find things that are remarkable in these other places, it means you're getting something from that advanced culture having moved along the way. And they also spread out an entire global grid in that period as well. So you do find things like pyramids in China. And, you know, so we get this sense of this diaspora, as it were. Now, one of the things I do think is fascinating when we get into Atlantis, though, is once the TUAOI network goes down, then you're left with a network of things like standing stones and pyramids and things that are no longer connected, because part of that connection had to do with the TUAOI stone. So you get a fragmentation of that culture. It would be like this culture if you no longer had satellites and, you know, global communications and things of that nature. You might still have some advances, but things would tend to go down. If we had a pole shift, how many people are really around who know how this technology works and could recreate it in a hurry? Not many. Not many. I mean, you know, it's a consumer culture, and there's not even so much of a problem with that, but it gives us an understanding, let's say, that the culture that was lost during the Atlantean times, there are stages of losing it. And also, because of the high technology ruining everything, it would kind of be like a major nuclear meltdown in this period. There was an instant reaction against the technology, so that at a certain point, instead of the TUAOI stone, people were just calling it the terrible crystal, the mighty terrible crystal, of which there's at least one reference in the Old Testament to the terrible mighty crystal. And what happens is you get these kind of portable versions of the technology, and they're called FireStones. And the priestesses in the Atlantean period would use those for attunement. They would hold the lapis stone and become attuned. Now, what they were attuning to, according to Cayce, was the saintly realm, quote unquote, and that the outer spheres. So they're getting these kind of spiritual messages. However, that same technology can be used for things like lasers and all the rest of it. So that's where we get the story in the Cayce readings of Belial and Emilius. And the Emilius group using it in a spiritual fashion, and the Belial group using it for this might makes right takeover. And I think the Cayce story is the most complete when it comes to Atlantis. There are incredible supporting stories, including some of the great research that took place coming into the Cayce era, from theosophy, from anthroposophy, and certainly Steiner's work on this gives us another doorway, which is Steiner is talking very much about the spirit projecting itself into matter and the different types of life waves that are coming into the earth at that time. So that's kind of the cosmic level. And here is Cayce saying in 1920, 1925, you know, well, these Atlantean ships are flying through things. You know, whatever it was conceived in the mind of the Atlantean, they could do. They could go to any part of the universe that they wanted to. So this is a very advanced culture, and they use their mental psychic abilities with the technology. So very often when we hear things about the UFO file and how there's a psychic aspect involved, this is a very Atlantean story, remember, as well, and keep that all in mind. So when we get into a person like Cayce, who after all came out of very humble circumstances in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, only went as far as the 6th grade in school, and, was a terrible student. But one thing that he found during this period of growing up when he went to school was that because of the intense pressure and including beatings that he got from his father, that he got a deep intuition that if he slept on his books, he could learn the material. This was like a weird psychic message that he got. And it worked. And he used it for the rest of his life for so many things, including the fact that when he went to go get jobs and things, he could memorize the catalog that the person had for the clothing store or whatever it was, just by resting his head against it. This is an unusual contact process that went on with Cayce. And there are a number of unusual things about him in terms of his manifestations energetically. I remember one of the stories about him working as an X-ray tech. And when he would do the X-ray, these triple images would show up of these spinal columns and things of this nature. So Cayce had a strange energy to him, not just when he was in trance. In everyday walking life, he had it as well. There are different stories about him when he grew angry, that fires would happen in places where he was angry. So in this one place, he came in angry from being stood up from this ride, and he went to sleep on that couch, and then, he went to go get something, and the couch burst into flames. So there's a kind of intense energy going along with this. And I think if you look into Eastern medicine and, the whole Qigong acupuncture aspect around this, you're going to find there's a whole energy body associated with a person that we don't get to see in everyday life. And so much of the mystery teachings, I think, that came out that talked about things like the etheric body and the astral body were to get us into this headspace of looking into this. So Cayce had a lot of unusual things, including the fact that he could see deceased relatives and converse with them even as a boy. And one of the kind of unusual stories that gets told about Cayce is that his grandfather was psychic and could move things. So he could lift tables and levitate them and things of this nature. And so, he was a companion with his grandfather everywhere. And the grandfather got thrown into a lake by a horse and drowned. And Cayce had to watch it because he was just a 5-year-old kid and he couldn't swim. And it was very traumatizing for him. But then afterwards, he would go to his parents and say, I'm conversing with him all the time. He's still around. He came to see me in my bedroom. We talk all the time. And Cayce said that literally this went on for months. So he already came in loaded with this. And there were a few unusual things in his childhood where he saw an angel who asked, what would you like? And he said, I want to be able to help the sick and things of this nature. So he had a lot of interdimensional spiritual happenings way before he became psychic. And one of the first readings that he gave was actually for himself when he got an injury when he was 12 years old with a baseball bat. And he was playing a game of baseball and somebody hit him on the head. And he was acting so bizarre that obviously he had some kind of swelling, and the doctors were trying to figure out what's wrong with this kid. And he said in a deep, authoritative voice, what you need to do is put a poultice at the base of the brain to draw some of the pressure off the skull. And, so that was probably the first reading. But eventually what happens with Cayce, and it's kind of the classic story with him, is that he loses his voice when he's 19 years old, and he's an insurance salesman. He goes around driving around selling insurance. So if you lose your voice doing insurance, forget it. It's over. Mm-hmm. And this goes on not for a month, not for 2 months, for a year, no voice. And having given up on everything, he goes, he has a friend who's into hypnotism. And he says, this isn't working. Like, you can't put me into a trance for some reason. He said, I have an idea, though. I think I can put myself into a trance. And so he says, if I do, just give me the instructions that my throat is better. And when he goes into this trance, he diagnoses himself and he says, you know, I need more circulation in my throat. And he wakes up and he spits up some blood and he has his voice back. And then the word of this unusual thing goes around and people start coming to him and say, hey, can you go into that trance again? You know, I have this or that illness going on, or my family does, and, you know, we'd like you to do this. And so the word spreads. And this is how Cayce becomes the sleeping prophet and the sleeping diagnostician. And this grows over time. So what happens is that that psychic process explodes into him starting to see people's past lives and then going into their past incarnations in Atlantis. And that brings us to this figure, Mitchell Hastings, and his role in Atlantis, according to Cayce, and how in this life he had come back, gained early access to Harvard at the age of 15, and was an IBM consultant and working with the government and all the rest of it. This incredible prodigy was now someone whose parents were very close to Cayce. And those parents have a very influential and interesting story of their own that I'll save for another episode. But because of this association, Hastings will end up coming under the tutelage of Cayce, and they will inspire each other in this whole search for Atlantean ruins in Arizona. How does that work? I'm going to tell you in a moment. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 191. It's Atlantis, Arizona, Lapis Cayce FireStone mystery. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. We'll go about 2 hours with you here tonight. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
George Gilbertson says, so what's really the point of the stones and crystals within so-called Atlantean culture? And Golden Warrior says, the crystals down at Atlantis are still working at times even today. When Columbus sailed across the Atlantic at night, his books say they could see lights coming up from the bottom of the ocean. It had to be the crystals working.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know, what's interesting about that with Columbus also is he said, you know, as he was getting close to Bimini of all places, he said, this looks like a flying candelabra. Hello, UFO sighting. But the fact that they were coming out of the water, I think, is fascinating. There's no question that the main operation of the TUAOI stone, like the real heavy hitter, was down there in the hot zone, somewhere in that stretch of area between Cuba and Bimini, Miami and the Yucatan. And all the things that happen right outside there with the Bermuda Triangle also give us, you know, put us in that mindset. In terms of what the stones mean, there's a major relationship between the vibrations of things in the earth and humanity. And just like, you know, we're using crystal for all sorts of things, for internet communications, for radio and everything else, it's all interactive. So when you get on a level of the ancients and you understand these things, you know, trees, stones, soil, and their spiritual implication, you're on a different level than just studying them on a scientific basis. And so there's a great revelation around these things in terms of what they can do, what they're for. There's so many undiscovered mysteries. You have to think about it. I mean, we've had flight for less than 125 years. So we're just coming into this. You know, they used to make kind of fairy stories in the 1800s about going to the moon, and well, we got there at some point, right? So things have been moving really fast when you look at it on a civilization clip. And I think part of that speed is why we're heading into a brick wall coming up with everything that's going on. So the use of that technology becomes very, very important. Yeah, what else you got?
The Buddhist of Boston Sports says they invert everything. Computer chips are silicon, batteries are lithium crystals, displays are liquid crystal. They are high tech. The Stone Age was actually high technology.
Yes, absolutely. Well, let's go into a point here about 1934. You have a 23-year-old Harvard graduate with wealthy parents and all these connections. And his best friend growing up is, and a frequent guest of his parents, is Krishnamurti. So Mitchell Hastings already, his life is already kind of pre-designed. And he's kind of like a Silicon Valley geek type. You know, he's a genius geek. One of the interesting things I found when I was looking for things related to Hastings is that he was a bit of a sketch artist when he's in his early 20s. And one of his paintings or drawings, what would you really call that? It's a pen drawing of some kind.
It looks like pen and ink to me.
Yeah, this is a very interesting figure, and there's a church in the background. And the blow up on this figure, I think, shows the mystical inclinations immediately with Hastings. Look at this unusual figure with a cane in that photo, or in that pen drawing. He's already on a mystical track at a very early age. And he has very unusual health ailments. This I also found interesting because he shares that with a number of people who are psychic. They bring the sensitivity into their everyday life. Their digestion tends to be sensitive. Psychics that I've known can be energetically sensitive to, loud noises or things of this nature. So they have a built-in sensitivity that manifests itself in other ways as well. And he's certainly one of those, because one of the things that Cayce does for him is he gives him a dozen or so readings on his health. And he's on a regular basis kind of giving the guy big updates. Now, Hastings will become a big shot in radio later, but I'm gonna sort of stick to his early life here for now. This is a shot of him becoming a hotshot later in life, running all of these radio stations and having worked for IBM and done all this different work. And it's very interesting when we get into his family as well, because what we're going to find out is that there may be some very deep, deep secrets about Hastings' work there, because his brother-in-law was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission. And the head of the Atomic Energy Commission had access to all of the UFO file, because that's where they were hiding the stuff and moving it through these different things. I found this picture of Hastings later in life at the top of the Prudential Center. In the Prudential Center, there was a very big radio station here for a number of years called WBCN. And when he started them, he made all these radio stations on the East Coast have a classical music format, and they all had to change to rock to survive. But here he is installing this special antenna at the top of the Prudential Center in Boston, this very unusual Atlantean that Edgar Cayce had said was involved directly during Atlantean times in the development of the TUAOI stone. We're going to see how Hastings really kind of fit into this mold and what his background was in Atlantis as well. Apparently, he was very closely associated with Edgar Evans Cayce. And Edgar Evans Cayce, it's known in Cayce circles that there's a reading there where Cayce says, many a soul is looking at Edgar Evans Cayce, who was this master scientist in Atlantis, and referring to him, thinking of him as the dreaded one, because it's basically like he's the one who dropped the TUAOI nuke, as it were. But a fascinating guy, Edgar Evans Cayce. I was very happy to meet him. This is a picture of Hastings with Cayce and Cayce's son, Hugh Lynn Cayce. I'll just put this up here. That's him over here. And of course, that's Cayce. They're on the top of the Empire State Building, I believe. And that's Hastings' mother. And Hugh Lynn, who's here, had terrible, terrible problems. Weird jealousy of Hastings, because I guess Hastings was a genius, was rich, and Cayce spent all this time giving him readings. So apparently Hugh Lynn did everything he could to get rid of him. And eventually that works, oddly enough. But, Hugh Lynn was a very human kind of guy. He was, he had mystical inclinations, but from everything that I hear about Hugh Lynn and from his bios and stuff, he was, he wasn't a person who held back, as it were. He was known to be obnoxious. Now, what happens is Cayce himself enters this terrible time in his life. The Depression has taken place, and the two stockbrokers that have been, kind of building Cayce's hospital there in Virginia Beach, and he's been giving them readings, and really, they've been making tremendous amounts of millions of dollars with him. They decide, well, they want to really control things, and who he can give readings to and all the rest. And there's some stories that they, in their, and he's been friends with them for 3 or 4 years at this point, but they actually wanted him to dress up in like a purple robe and only give them readings, not give readings to other people. So he wasn't going to go for that, and they pull their support, and they do all these spiteful things on the way out, as it were, including getting Cayce arrested for practicing medicine without a license, which will happen in New York. And there's a series of things that are associated with that. So it leads him to the lowest point in his life, where he's lost the hospital, the Depression has happened, and the person who helped him set up the hospital, Dr. Thomas House, is very important for the early kind of Cayce medical readings and things. He dies. So Cayce is really adrift, and the readings themselves suggest that the spiritual world wants to grab Cayce back because the material world doesn't get him, and that basically things better start to go better for him. So it's in this period when he's just, hit rock bottom that these readings around the Two-Eye Stone and this thing about Arizona come up. And Cayce does a very odd and unusual thing, is that he takes off with Hastings, and they leave and drive from Virginia Beach, and they head to Arizona, and they're going to Bisbee, which is where the readings indicate they're going to find this very special stone, which was the core of the Atlanteans' attunement. And this all opens up a gigantic thing about the Two-Eye Stone, which wasn't there on the record in the Cayce work beforehand. So he needs Hastings for this. And the things that they will reveal are amazing when you get into this. And I want to say this about the Two-Eye Stone. It's TUAOI. You've heard me refer to it many times in this program. I think it becomes even more important as we come up to a crossroads of, all the satellite technology, all the LIDAR, and all the things that are going on. We're going to be able to see this ancient civilization. And I'm sure that they already have on the side of the inside governments and things of this nature. And a lot of the work that I've done around the HOTZONE pertains to the, basic geopolitical wars that are going on in that department. And so we're going to have to face this advanced technology that we had misused, destroyed the planet with, and how we're coming back to it now. So this realization around the Two-Eye thing coming out of the mystery school work in gradations. You had Blavatsky bringing it out, you had Besant and a number of theosophists bringing it out, and then it comes into that Steiner work, and Steiner gives us a great opening on it, but it seems like he holds a few things back, and then there is Cayce giving you the full background. So now we've had a number of years to grapple with it. I mean, Cayce died in 1945. His work got popularized in 1968, and that's when there was a huge wave of Atlantis sort of books and documentaries, movies, and all the rest of it. But if we go back to this very interesting month-long excursion to Arizona, we're going to find some very unusual things take place, including massive visions as they go there that both of them have. And apparently it's learned later that there's something about Hastings and Cayce where they trigger each other off psychically, and that Cayce becomes even more psychic in the presence of this former Atlantean. And some of the things that he sees are quite unusual. And what's interesting is Hastings, when he's doing, he's conducting the readings when they're in Arizona, and he starts to see the things that Cayce is talking about. So they're both in this very, kind of Dionysian, major illusory period where they can just see into things. And some of the things that come out of that are quite remarkable. I'm going to get into that next. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Sorry, my throat's giving me a hard time.
Sure.
Give me that.
That is the temperature changes going on here. You get 60 degrees in Cambridge one day, 40 degrees the next day. I want to point out a couple of interesting things about the location as well. One of them is that in Bisbee, of course, there's this incredible Queen's copper mine. And the mine already has an unusual lore to it that has nothing to do with Cayce or Hastings. But it's known for having this incredible tonnage come out of it, of all of this copper. It has other elements as well. But the different copper ores from lapis to azurite and others come up in the middle of all this. And so there are two locations that are spotlighted during their trip. One of them is Bisbee, and the other one is Nogales. What I found out when they said that they went to Mexico, I found that interesting because, you know, it seems like in the story to go from Bisbee to Mexico, somehow they had heard about another mine. But what I learned is that there's a Nogales on this side of the border, and there's a Nogales on that side of the border. And so it's my contention, actually, that the Nogales that they went to was the one there by Keno Springs, because there are mines there. Now, it could have been in Mexico, but in any case, what they do is they go in like miners, and they go deep, deep under the earth, go mining for this very, very unusual lapis. And the story of how they got there, I'm going to read that actual reading that they got in relation to this as well. One of the things I want to point out is when you start to talk about this period of time when he's down there, it seems like there are a number of obstacles that Cayce has to face immediately. And, you know, we have to remember that Cayce, from the time he was young and discovering this incredible gift that he had, he already is experiencing difficulties. So he gets thrown out of church. He's a Sunday school teacher. He gets thrown out of church for doing his psychic readings and having visions and talking about reincarnation and things of this nature. So already he's had to, you know, endure a great deal. And then he also has a lot of financial difficulties and things growing up. And then whenever he goes to do something besides his psychic work, like he becomes a very good photographer for a number of years, but the photography studio burns down, you know, so it seems like whenever he takes a different course off of his psychic life, all of the protections are gone. It's something push him back into this role of becoming the sleeping prophet. And I think when we look at the different stages of Cayce over the years, we can see this development. It's like he accepts what his role is. Even if the world is afraid of his psychic activity, he knows what a great thing it's doing individually for people. And once it opens up to this larger spiritual, philosophical context of life readings and Atlantis and Egypt and things like that, then I think he overcomes his fear, including the fact that his readings are used to treat his son and his wife for tuberculosis and his son for a massive burn. And so he starts to kind of trust his own psychic wisdom, which represents a change, I think. And that's where you get the Cayce and the readings that we know. When I go into Cayce's work early on, I find him being engaged in 1917 by Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison. Those readings both disappeared. They're out of the archives. They don't exist. There's a few things like that, including follow-up readings around Bimini that just disappeared because the business group that hired him to do it decided we don't want anyone to have a copy of this. In the Mitchell Hastings case, readings also disappear because Hastings had this incredible mechanical, fixation. He wanted to record everything. And so he records 9 out of his 14 readings, and all the recordings except one disappear. Now, another unusual thing about these readings that Cayce will do for Hastings is that in all of the readings that Cayce does, very rarely does his voice ever change. It's always in the regular Edgar Cayce voice. But in this case, things totally change and get strange to the point where they say that his voice sounded like a totally different person. So again, something about Hastings and his, weird Atlantean background are sparking all of these different things with Cayce. The question is, what happened to them when they went to Arizona? That's what we're going to get into now. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 191. It's the Cayce TUAOI Arizona Atlantis mystery. We're taking your questions here shortly. I'd say in about 20 minutes or so. And I want to remind you, while I have your attention, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch through all the things and the difficulties that we see online in social media and everywhere else, really suppressing good information. So the way to get around all that is just to be on the newsletter list, and we'll let you know about the incredible documentaries and things we have coming up, live X-Series shows, and interviews that will blow your mind, all coming up here in March and April and May. Fantastic lineup, including new episodes of the CRAZE in the HOTZONE, the Hacking Atlantis miniseries that we're doing, which really takes on everything from the Steiner work, Cayce's work, to all the incredible discoveries made, including of a lost city off the coast of Cuba, and Paulina Zalitsky. I mean, it's all in there. So you're going to get episode 2 of that. Episode 1 is in the description of this video. And it's got incredible feedback. People really got it. So it's kind of like, what happens is, I think with the HOTZONE, we've done so many episodes on it. This is the real distilling down and adding new things to it as well. So it's a real kind of 90-minute odyssey. And by the end of it, you're going to know everything there is to know about the HOTZONE. In part 2, just wait, because part 2 of that particular documentary is going to blow your mind. What do you got over there?
Okay. Audra Warlas says azurite is known as, quote, mountain blue, or as Cayce called it, lapis linguis, or the stone of heaven. It is a single mineral with deeper blue. Lapis lazuli is a rock with several minerals and harder. From Thought says azurite is the stone Cayce went to look for and has postulated it is what powers Atlantis. It has copper infused in it. Terry Dougherty says copper is a conductor. And Jen Passavant says lapis lazuli is not a copper-based stone. Azurite, Arizona lapis, and malachite are.
Isn't that interesting? Well, Cayce will identify it, and he will say this is the true lapis, but it seems like they're all variations of the same thing. So we're talking really about the potency. And I'm going to get into how that works. I'm going to show you that singing stone. But one of the things I picked up on, which is related to the Tesla part of what I just mentioned, is this Bloomfield Moore work and his excavations. And his mother was this incredible woman who funded the work of John Keeley and Theosophy and Nikola Tesla. So she was very close in all of this. And he went on all these various expeditions, I believe at the behest of Edgar Cayce. Now, I have not found the link between the Bloomfields and the Cayces yet, but I'm sure it's there. In any case, what he found in Florida, and I found his unusual book, and I publicized this a few years ago, and there have been various researchers who've picked up on it, I've noticed. But this is very important because I don't think they understand what it is. I believe this is the emblem of the TUAOI stone because there's a number of different reasons for it. And that is the image there. Now, that is copper too, but it has turned green. But that particular symbol of the eye in this kind of dart, I'm going to show you how this one goes along and how some of the later discoveries prove this whole thing out. This is the singing stone, which is actually a it's a very interesting story in and of itself. This is incredible 9,000-pound stone that comes out of this quarry there at the Queen's Mine in Bisbee. Now, that's the stone, and Cayce recommends to Hastings that he go to the Natural Museum in New York and that he sit next to it and listen to it.
Wow.
And what happens is this guy has all kinds of unusual interactions with this. And then Cayce says, in Arizona, in Bisbee, you're going to find more of this, and it's going to be your Atlantean attunement. Just to give you some impression of the size here, I mean, this thing is massive. And what is that? Is that amethyst behind it?
Looks like it.
Yeah. So one of the unusual things that happened that I found as an interesting story is that when at a certain point they moved the stone and apparently put it behind glass, and then a lot of people couldn't hear it. The singing stone stopped singing, as it were. But apparently this thing now has moved around, and some people claim that they can hear it again. But there's a few news stories about it, which I find kind of intriguing. I want to give a couple of images about lapis and its importance to the ancient Egyptians. If you go back, especially into the pre-dynastic period, you're going to find them using lapis for almost everything that has a religious or spiritual symbology. One of the most compelling is this image of Isis with Horus in her lap. And this is very early. This is from 3000 BC, so it's before the pyramids technically were built in history, even though we know they go back and are much, much older. And in Cayce's timeline are from 10,500 BC. That is the image, this lapis statue. So we have to remember the significance for the Egyptians of the lapis and for the Atlanteans as that legacy culture. But some of those finds you will see if you look at the King Tut funeral mask, that the whole thing is gold and lapis. And if you look into the Book of the Dead and some of the ancient references to Ra, the sun god, he is supposed to be made of lapis and gold. So the ancients are giving us a hint here. What I found out recently is that the term sapphire used in the Bible is a mistranslation through the King James Version that got handed down, and that every reference to sapphire, when they went back and looked at it in Latin, meant lapis. So all of the sapphire references and Solomon and all the rest are all about lapis. So we're dealing with a very kind of high-end, very, very important piece here. Now let's talk about this mine for a little bit. This Queen's Mine, the copper mine in Bisbee, which the readings drew Hastings and Cayce to. This is an image of a massive meeting in 1897 where all the masons of the world gathered together. And it was all in that Bisbee mine. It's quite a remarkable shot, but it gives us, again, that occult, as it were, significance of the mine for these groups. They understood the power. And another thing about the mine is it was not discovered until the 1870s. So the thing is a great kind of modern revelation in that sense, even though it's no longer technically in operation. And there's some unusual stories about that as well. But one of the things we can say about it is for a long time, for close to 100 years, it was the top producer of copper, and they just produced it out. Now, you know me, I went deep into looking, how does the UFO file fit into this?
Before you move on,
Yeah.
Esoteric 369 is asking, is that a lapis or a copper mine? With the
No, it's a
masons?
copper mine.
Okay.
Yeah, but certainly all of the lapis, because lapis is a copper ore, comes out of that mine. And it's interesting because I had a friend scout it out for me sometime in the past couple of years. And what I heard is that there are big chunks of this lapis all over the place outside of that mine now. Okay. Close Encounters of the Third Kind. You might remember a very interesting scene there. J. Allen Hynek, of course, is in that. Remember Project Blue Book? Well, it's very interesting because at the end there, these aliens who've abducted all of these missing airmen and everything else, they release them, and Hynek is there with these generals looking on as they announce, here is so-and-so who disappeared on this plane, and now the aliens have returned him. So in the movie, it's very interesting. Among the names of those returning from the alien mothership was Rudolph E. Dolores, reported missing December 1951, Bisbee, Arizona. It tells me that the people in Close Encounters, again, are plugged in to this. And you can tell when you watch that movie that there's a lot of esoteric information as well. Cayce, as I mentioned, his psychic function, when he was burned out or when he was depressed, as he was in this period, didn't work so well. So he sort of needed to be recalibrated. So when the hospital closes and the Blumenthals, who are his funders, take the money away, and his life has kind of gone down, like I said, you know, they try to set him up with a practicing medicine without a license charge because they were resentful of the fact that they couldn't use his abilities anymore. And it's a completely ridiculous charge. He just gave a reading to someone who was in disguise. She was a policewoman. And, you know, so they gave him this phony charge. And the judge let him off, but it was kind of a humiliating experience. Then his mother dies. Then his friend, the doctor who built the hospital with him, dies. So he was pretty much in one of the worst funks of his entire life. So that's one of the reasons that he will go off on this escapade with our friend. And I'm going to read a little bit of what he has to say about our friend Hastings, and then a little more about their trip down there. Then we'll go to your questions.
Okay, sounds good.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 191. We're going deep here on the Atlantis, Arizona Lapis connection with the TUAOI stone, the FireStone of the Cayce readings, which is something that I think we need to get our heads wrapped around very closely as we're deep into the technology and technocracy wars going on currently. If you watch this show and you watch any of my Hot Zone episodes, of which there are now, I believe, 31, something like that, you can see the Hot Zone is quite the fascination for the work that we do here at the Dark Journalist Show. You might be familiar with the story of Margaret Adams. Well, her other name is Margaret Sanders, and she is the daughter of Colonel Sanders. And she ran the most extensive search for Atlantis using Colonel Sanders' cache. And many of her discoveries were hidden, but the one person that she shared so many of those discoveries with was Marvin Minsky. And Marvin Minsky is the original creator of AI, and he was over here at MIT, the ultimate transhumanist in that sense. And his best friend there in the last years of his life was none other than Jeffrey Epstein. Mm-hmm. So if you want the rest of that story, since Epstein's been in the news a lot here, although it's been a lot of hot air, you might want to go to the Craze and the Hot Zone documentary. Okay. Now, this is Hastings asking some questions here during his early Cayce readings. Going back to the Atlantean incarnation, what was the TUAOI stone? What shape or form was it? And Cayce says, it was in the form of a six-sided figure, in which the light appeared as the means of communication between infinity and the finite, or the means whereby there were the communications with those forces from the outside. Later, this came to mean that from which the energies radiated, as of the center, from which there were those radial activities guiding the various forms of transitions or travel through those periods of activities of the Atlanteans. It was set as a crystal, though in quite a different form from that used there. Do not confuse these two. For aeroplanes, there are many generations of difference of the crystal. It was in those periods when there was the directing of airplanes as a means of travel. Through these, and what would travel in the air, or in the water, or under the water, just the same. Yet the force from which these were directed was in the central power station, or TUAOI stone. And which, as the beam acted upon the stone in the beginning, it was the source from which there was the spiritual or mental contact. Understand there are the following laws. If there would be the understanding, the comprehension of these, for as has been given, the basis, the beginning of law carries all the way through. And that which comes or begins first is conceived in spirit, grows in the mental, manifests in the material. As was this central force in the Atlantean experience. First, it was the means and source of manners by which the powers that be made the centralization of making known to the children of man, the children of God, the directing forces or powers. The Atlanteans eventually turned this into a channel for destructive forces, and is growing towards this again in the present. Now, he gives a pretty good complete outline there when you get into the Cayce work. I remember one time there was somebody who said, is there a way to get Cayce? They actually asked the source this during a reading. Is there a way to get Cayce to simplify this? Because the language is very dense to get through. And the Cayce source said, better your understanding. So I guess we better our understanding. Here's what I take away from that, which is that first group, the Amelius group, is using it, as I said, as an attunement tool. And that's what it's meant for. But it has a materialization in this realm, and the materialization is very powerful. So once you go from spiritual communication, you still have this physical energy left over. And that's what the Atlanteans will use. And they'll learn at first that they can power things with it. They can heat their homes. They can fly through the air. They can fly through things. So there's a dematerialization process, an apotheum that takes place with this as well. So their advancement, I would put them many years beyond the technology that we have now, as impressive as we are with everything that we're doing. We're certainly catching up, but, the whole wisdom factor is growing not quite at the same speed. So the knowledge is getting way ahead of the wisdom. The imbalance back in the Atlantean period created such a divergence from humanity's evolution that it almost took the entire course of humanity off of its evolutionary track. That's where the memories of the technology and the use of steganography through the mystery schools that get passed down through Egypt and the Mayans will become absolutely crystallized through that process for years and years, and they will carry and keep that knowledge of technological advancement away from humanity because of the things that took place. The question is, what was it that Cayce and the source with Hastings were going down to Arizona to find? This is the next piece of what we're going to get into. Before we do, I want to show that very same image that I was showing of the TUAOI, piece with the eye and the various edges, that shows up in a number of things that feel they're either from the mound builders or they're leftovers. And they feel like the stragglers of the Atlantean culture going into America. And we know that Cayce said that they became the mound builders in Ohio, in the Mississippi Valley, and in New Mexico, Utah, and other places. So when we're looking at the symbol, you can find in the mounds of Spiro, Oklahoma, this unusual image again that we're getting of the strange design around the eye here. Now that is the representative now of the TUAOI stone. It's gone from the copper plates. Now the priests who maintain it and are holding on to it, they're using it as part of the eye design. That lets you know they're the ones who are overseeing the technology. we have to remember when we get into the Cayce readings, whenever he talks about the TUAOI stone and the things that the Atlanteans were doing, that when they hid the records in the Sphinx, under the right paw of the Sphinx, that they also did it in 2 other places. And so they're in 3 places around the world. So one of those places, as we know, is Bimini, and it's in the sunken edge of Bimini off the northern expanse. And it's underwater there, and that part of that is the Bimini Wall. And so that Poseidon temple that holds the Hall of Records is there, and it's rising. But the other one is not often talked about, and this is why I did an episode called Pawgate last year, because in Yucatan, there is another Hall of Records buried under a temple. And it's interesting because Cayce referred to it as Yucatan, but in that period of time that he's referring to this, it actually may be based on a lot of different research in Guatemala that the other piece is there. And one of the things I found in that Yucatan Guatemala expanse is that there was, in fact, a Yucatan Sphinx, and that it disappeared. So it was a massive statue on top of this structure. So the paw as the symbol we're going to find is the symbol of this group hiding the technology. And that's where the whole Pawgate thing came from. Now, when we go into that period of saving the information and saving the sacred information around the Hall of Records, what they're doing is they're preserving it for humanity to rediscover it at some later date. It's like a holy time capsule, basically. And they're thinking also, you know, we're going to do it in such a way with the pyramid and the Sphinx and everything else that even if they've forgotten how this language goes, if the language changes, we're going to save those changes in scientific formula through mathematics, through geometry, and things of that nature. So that's what they do. And so Cayce is saying, look, all 3 of those records, you're going to find them. They're exactly the same, but they're hidden in 3 places. So, you know, Egypt has become a very difficult situation in terms of getting and extracting that. And the Bimini thing is something I think is a very great possibility for getting the Hall of Records. But the Yucatan one is probably going to be, in a sense, the easiest to get at. And so I'm going to get into how all that works as well. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X-Series 191 Atlantis, Arizona, Lapis Cayce, FireStone Mystery. A little more on the Hastings readings, and then the trip that will really be quite the trip for Cayce and Hastings down to Arizona, including the apparition of Cayce's dead mother and Hastings' future wife, who both appear while they're doing this mining for the lapis stones. Okay. Here's what he has to tell Hastings, a 23-year-old wunderkind. Before this incarnation, we find the entity was in the Atlantean periods when much of the destructive forces were being maintained by the religious political activities, as would be termed, of the period. The entity was among those who were set upon to apply their ability in relationships in the varied conditions that were to be brought about to impel a people to submit to the influences of might to be brought to bear. This is the Belial taking the technology and using it to have these different people submit. So they're using Hastings, the Belial group, as a scientist to get him to operate the TUAOI stone so they can use it to basically control these people. Hence, this is not of a constructive influence, yet the abilities may be found in yourself in the present in the application of mechanical appliances for electrical influences that may bring healing or destructive influences. At that period, they were used by the entity Acyl Sign as destructive influences, and they have destructive all in caps, which means his voice boomed. This is what they do. Hence, the warnings that may be given respecting the abilities of this entity as to what it may attain and how this would be. There's set before you abilities out of the ordinary ken, particularly in the fields of activity that would apply to electrical or gaseous forces applied in electrical emanations that may be builded in the present experience for constructive or destructive purposes in the application in the lives of individuals. For as seen from the spiritual realm, in the present experience there is, from the spheres, the re-entering or rebirth from the Earth's environment of those who are active in Atlantis. From such forces, from such influences, from such sources, may the entity be led or be read into abilities which, if applied in the proper direction, may make for self in the present experience a soul development that may bring blessings to many within the creative forces. And then he goes on to tell him, you basically are walking a tightrope. You can use this for destructive purposes, or you can really bring it to a higher level. Now, it's interesting to me because all of his activities after this Cayce period are oriented around radio. And one of the things that I find fascinating is I think that his secret work around the TUAOI stone went underground, and that he carried that on, and that there's no real record of it. But I think also it's unusual to me that his brother-in-law was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, because here we have basically the modern TUAOI stone rollout in the technology. So we need to keep that in mind as well. So Cayce, when he goes down there, he's having these extreme visions, and there are people coming to him out of the past. They're dressed in Egyptian clothing. They're dressed in Atlantean clothing. They are bringing forward an entirely, they're trying to almost give Cayce a doctrine. And Hastings is starting to witness some of this while they're there. And the whole story, I've told the story about how they got to the mine and how the readings led them to the mine and asked them to go interact with a person who had been dead for over 50 years. And so it leads them to this thing, but it's almost like it's looking at a different timeline. And, you know, when they go to hunt down the manager of the particular mine and they give the name that was given in the readings, the guy who's working there tells them, that guy's been dead for 50 years. So there was already some unusual things that were going on there. During this whole wave of them trying to hunt down a way to get into the Queen's mine, a very unusual red-haired woman shows up, and she interacts with Hastings. And Hastings thinks, this is not a real person. She's like glowing, basically. And she says, you can find, you know, the particular person you're looking for if you just ask the workman who the managing supervisor is. She walks away. And then later he will see her again. And then Cayce will see her on the train back. So she's showing up as this kind of apparition, Atlantean apparition, trying to move them off into the right position.
Are Atlanteans redheads, largely?
Well, it's very interesting because there's two schools of thought about it. But yes, fundamentally, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I want to say is that this trip seems like it was set up directly in the readings, so that the readings were looking at the situation, and they knew that Hastings needed to be inspired, but they knew that Cayce needed to come back to life, as it were. So there's a lot of supernatural things that take place during this trip. What's interesting is this woman, the redhead, is going to be the woman that Hastings will meet and marry later. And she will say, I never met you in Bisbee, or I never met Cayce, but thank you. It's flattering for you to think of me. He's going to meet her in New York under completely different circumstances, and that's going to be his wife. So there's something hyperdimensional going on immediately in this whole situation. And let me tell you, that's the tame part of the story. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 191. This is Atlantis, Arizona, Lapis, TUAOI, FireStone mystery. We're going to take your questions here shortly, in about 10 minutes. And you can ask those of Miss Olivia right now. She's putting them all together. Before I go any further, what do you got?
From Thought says, wasn't the god that came to South America in those tales redheaded Viracocha?
Well, he's very unusual, too. He definitely, just like the whole thing with the Peruvian coneheads, basically these are psychic rulers. And that whole piece is not very well investigated because, even Viracocha sounds like the stuff of legend. Quetzalcoatl, these are psychic masters who, are coming in that whole egress from Atlantis. And so when they come in and deal with a primitive tribe, they really seem to be different types of beings. And in this sense, the Atlanteans absolutely were. They were kind of a different quality of human. And I'm going to give a little more information about the setup of this from this reading. And so Cayce's source is telling Hastings, stay in Phoenix or in Prescott, particularly if there is to be the seeking of the conditions in the country. Phoenix and north and west from there, not great distances, may be found 2 or 3 various lapis deposits that may be found in the most beneficial and many of the experimentations in which this body is interested. Look for Ringle. A.L. Ringle is meant in Phoenix. In this particular portion of the country, is interested in mines of various characters. Don't be carried off by him into gold prospecting or into searching for more precious gems. For lapis is not considered a high quality of gem, rather a very low form. But for that indicated in the character of the stone itself, it would be most helpful in creating the vibration which will make for the developments of certain characters of demonstrations with any psychic forces in any psychic individuals. This will be a very interesting experiment for you. Go to the New York Museum of Natural History. Sit by the large quantity of this type of stone, the singing stone, and listen to it sing. Do it in the open. Don't let others make a fool of you or their remarks overcome you. Just sit by it and listen to it sing, for it will. This is the one from the Queen's Mine in Arizona. And then he goes on to suggest the exact ranch and the exact people he should contact. As I mentioned, when he goes there, he finds out the person had died 50 years ago. So something strange is going on. And then Hastings says, well, describe the stones to me so that I might be able to locate them. And again, Cayce says, go and look at them in the museum. You'll see. And then he goes on from there, but he is getting information from this person who's doing this automatic writing. And so Cayce says, well, that's all fine that you're doing that, but, it's like there's a problem. You have a problem there, and either you deal with the problem or, you move on. And so it's left as a big question in the readings. What is that all about? So there's this little note from Gladys Davis in there that says that somehow Hastings got involved in a love triangle with the woman who was doing the automatic reading and her husband, and they broke up, and Hastings was to blame, basically. So the readings are kind of, being helpful along the way, saying it's good that you're interested in automatic writing, but avoid any of these strange entanglements. What do you got?
Jumpjet says, so azurite from the Bisbee area is the singing stone Cayce speaks about?
Yes.
Okay.
It was pulled up from the Queen's copper mine in Bisbee. And according to the ARE, and I've looked at it in the Natural Museum of History, the stone itself weighs 9,000 pounds, which is a remarkable specimen. And its importance in terms of what it can do is highlighted by the fact that the Atlanteans were going to Bisbee and mining back in that period. So it's quite interesting to me when the Bisbee mine gets rediscovered in the 19th century. This is, again, it's Atlantean memory, as it were. And they had been mining it to create the TUAOI stone, because somehow the lapis is associated with the TUAOI stone. This is the interesting, fascinating crisscross of what that mine is doing there in Bisbee, and the Atlanteans going there, doing their mining operations and coming out. That's also very early activity of Atlanteans working in America, as it were. So, yeah, that's interesting. What else you got?
Caritas Tarot says it's a redhead that appeared in Jack Parsons' life after he and L. Ron Hubbard did the Moonchild spell.
Oh, yeah. She was the witch of Los Angeles. Marjorie Hamilton? Is that her name? Absolutely fascinating. And real, like a real witch.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, a little bit more. This is the interesting thing I want to say about Hastings and why it's so important in this whole story to understand what the TUAOI stone is. It's a central kind of evolutionary tool for humanity. So that's what it's meant for, the TUAOI stone. And then it becomes also providing for every physical convenience. Then it becomes such a weapon of war, as it were, that they use it for all these various purposes. So that's when it turns and eventually it destroys the island and it pulls everything down and it almost takes the earth out. So I want to give this impression of just how important the TUAOI stone is. The story of the FireStone, the mighty terrible crystal, and these things, there's a reason why there's this legend back there, and everyone thinks it's a comet, you know, and I'm sure we had incredible comet impacts and things of this nature. But Cayce's story of the TUAOI stone is the destruction of Atlantis. So whatever it was that was active in that, probably because it had this spiritual physical interface, that when it was used in this abusive fashion and caused these incredible destructions, it almost took the entire Earth development phase out. So that's why you get this mystery hanging over. That's why there's amnesia back there as well. In the Gurdjieff work, you know, he talks about this Kundabuffer organ that we discovered and developed in that period of time because humanity just couldn't face the things that were going on. And so they developed an organ to see things as they were not. And so that's something that we're still getting rid of in our evolutionary track because it was a very unnatural thing that got attached there to humanity. But whatever it was with the destruction of the TUAOI stone was so terrible that, you know, when we think of it almost taking the entire spiritual evolutionary track out, at that stage, let's say that stage ended in 10,000 BC, you know, this is a buildup. Remember, the Atlantean story is 250,000 years. So we're looking at kind of the foundational memory, ancestral memory of humanity. And then it's remembered in legend, it's remembered, and we finally get it through the Plato story. And people have said, well, you know, Plato was writing a fairy tale or whatever. There's nothing even vaguely fairy tale-ish about his story of Atlantis. It's all very punctuated, the way that he describes it. So he's giving a real description. And remember, he says it's not even his story. He had a relative there who went off and went to Egypt and talked to the priest of Sais, and the priest of Sais gave him the story 7,500 years earlier. Your Athenian ancestors battled these Atlanteans. So that's what we have. That's the actual story on the record. It's very interesting because they've tried to keep Atlantis isolated away from human consciousness. This is why I think the Cayce work is so innovative in this sense. Let's think about this for a minute. There's so many specials that try to tie in the search for Atlantis with Nazism. And they did that to Graham Hancock's special too when he did that thing on Netflix. They were like, oh, this is like a Nazi thing. Look, because the Nazis were interested in finding Atlantis, it doesn't have anything to do with Atlantis. That doesn't mean it's a fascist thing. It just means they were obsessed with it. And they were into everything occult. And of course, they were into Blavatsky's work and everything else because they knew that this is the stuff. And, you know, they were drawing from their own mystery school and working it upside down, very much like we see the forces doing now. But I found it interesting that I watched a number of documentaries, and I found, most of the documentaries on Atlantis are very poor, extremely poor. It's a very rare exception. They don't get it. And they always end with some weird skeptic saying, well, this could lead to Nazism. And the History Channel was doing this for a while. I was like, why are they inserting this over and over again? What's going on here? And it is that keeping you away from thinking about it, because somewhere there's some, Wikipedia entry that says this is related to Nazism. The search for Atlantis the memory of Atlantis is deep in humanity. It has nothing to do with Nazism at all. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. It's X Series 191, Atlantis, Arizona, Lapis Cayce mystery. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch, and there's some exciting things we're going to be announcing in there shortly, so make sure that you stand up and be counted. Take an extra minute to do that. Before I jump into this next section, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Okay, so Nanette Chris says, Cayce says gods and goddesses were Atlantean royals. Many had auburn hair, Rh negative blood, some elongated skulls. I saw Jesus, and his hair is coppery, as Cayce described. I have to say, I had a past life regression once where I saw Jesus, and he was
interesting,
like chestnutty red hair.
Oh, wow.
Also, Lori Carrington, this is offbeat, says, fun fact, redheads are notoriously very difficult to get numb for dental procedures. I'm a dental hygienist, and it's known and taught in dental school. I don't know what that means, but fascinating.
Well, my mother was a redhead. My various members of my family are redheads, interestingly enough. So I've had some interesting experiences with them. I would say this, that there is something to that. Cayce's description of Jesus is that Jesus had red and curly hair, and that he had blue eyes, and that he was lacking a Jewish or Aryan profile. So he just was unusual looking. Rata, in the Cayce readings, has an unusual appearance. He's bald. He doesn't have any hair. He has no eyebrows. So he's from a daughter of Zu who didn't have a human father. So, we know about the Immaculate Conception. We know, and that in relation to John as well. But something strange when it comes to the story about Rata, because I think early on we're getting the hint that there's some high spiritual activity involved in this interbreeding. It has nothing to do with aliens. And that it's an Elohim aspect interfacing directly. That's why Rata doesn't have a human father. So, that might start to tell us what's going on here, because when we look at the Cayce readings, Rata, when Cayce was Rata, he was deeply, deeply involved with setting up what? The Sphinx and the pyramid. But that's 10,500 BC. Traditional archaeology has you at 2,500 BC, which shows you how much of a problem traditional archaeology has. Remember, one of the fascinating things that Cayce said in relation to this is that what was it that they were doing in that area of Giza? Archaeology. They were doing archaeology in 10,500 BC. That's Rata and Hermes setting up the Giza Plateau. So if that's archaeology, then the civilization, that plateau is so ancient. How old does that have to be? So, we're already 8,000 years off, but it's much older than that. Think about that one. Okay.
Another
Go
comment?
ahead, yes.
Okay, David Tormina. The legends say the tribe of Dan was of red hair.
Uh-huh.
And also, from David, DJ, the Native American two-eye stone symbol is said to be the eye of the falcon. The Egyptian eye of Horus is said to represent a god with the head of a falcon. Do you suspect these symbols are linked?
Oh, that's interesting. That's very, very interesting. I don't think that either the mounds or Bloomfield's work in Florida have been researched properly. And I don't think that they know what this stuff is. But I think if we apply Cayce's thing about the fleeing Atlanteans going into America, then we're going to get a hint, There's that fascinating story that he tells about Iltar, and Iltar is one of the top people in Poseidia. Before it goes down, he gets the psychic hint, you can't stay here much longer. He goes to Yucatan and he sets up a culture with only 50 people that's just at the same height as the rest of Atlantis was. So when Atlantis and Poseidia go down, he's there in the Yucatan and he set up this whole thriving culture. And all these Atlanteans fleeing come in there and they overwhelm Iltar so that he has to go from the Yucatan into America. So he's kind of an interesting, almost Noah-like hero in the Cayce story. But I think that there's a lot. Remember, Cayce's giving us a lot. How much can we take? Even the whole mystery around Lapis versus Azurite and things like that, there might be a reason why it wasn't very clearly spelled out, that you might have to look and go 3 or 4 levels deep to get the right answer. I'm sure that's true in relation to Steiner's work. But that Iltar, I have that picture here somewhere because I think it is very telling. Why don't you go ahead?
While you're looking for that, this is so fascinating. From Thought says, my ancestor was a dude that lived to be 125 and moved to Kentucky in 1800. He apparently had the same skills as Cayce. There's a whole article about him, George Burkhart from Harlan, Kentucky.
Oh, really?
Have you heard about this person?
No.
We've got some research to do.
I will say this, that right there in Hopkinsville, there's one of the weirdest of all time, strange alien encounters where this very, legit farming family just show up and they're all
Are these the roof ones?
Yeah, they're the weird kind of goblin looking ones.
Right.
Here's a shot of that Queen's mine. This is the mine that Cayce and Hastings went to. Imagine going in there and just the vibe. You can get that hint. Now think about all those Masons meeting in there. We're starting to understand it's a sacred spot. There's no question about it. And the readings are drawing both Cayce and our friend there. This is a little different, but it's the Lady of Elche. That is very, very interesting. This was found in Spain, and it's certainly an Atlantean artifact. What they found out was that the headdress in the back, it's not hair, but it detaches. So it was something that the figure put on. So what was that all about? This could be kind of the Urim and Thummim of the Atlantis Spain factor.
It's not that she looks like Gigi, but she has the countenance of Gigi.
Oh,
when
Gigi,
I see that immediately, I thought of her.
Absolutely.
She has such grace and nobility.
Yes. No question about it. Well, let's see. Hastings. I mentioned a few things about his radio career. Here he is giving Cayce the opportunity to talk about the TUAOI stone by asking him questions. And so we get the deep, deep information about the TUAOI stone through the Hastings reading. So we're starting to get a hint of the impact of the Hastings character. In the center of a building, this is a description of the TUAOI stone. The FireStone that was in the experience did the activities of the entity. Then it made those applications that dealt with constructive but ultimately destructive forces in the period. In the center of the building where it was held, that today would be said to have been lined with non-conductive metals, something akin to asbestos or other non-conductors. The building above the stone was oval, or a dome, wherein there would be, or there could be, the rolling back, so that the activity of the stone was received from the sun's rays or from the stars, the concentrating of the energies that emanate from bodies that are on fire themselves. These are stars. These are distant stars. Arcturus is on fire. And the elements that are found and that are not found in the Earth's atmosphere. That's interesting too. The concentration through the prisms of glass, as would be called in the present, was such in a manner that it acted upon the instruments that were connected to the various modes of travel through induction methods. This is anti-gravity. This is Atlantean anti-gravity. There's no question. This is what made much of the character of control, of remote control through radio vibrations and directions. See? This would be termed in the present day, though the manner of the force that was impelled from the stone acted upon the motivating forces in the crafts themselves. Cayce's giving you the whole outlay there. The TUAOI stone is connecting in with these crafts. It's receiving its impulses from the stars, from the sun, from other places. It's feeding that energy out. And we're getting all that. This is the deeper description now, because when he mentions the TUAOI stone before, he talks about it. He says it's a six-sided figure and everything. But you're not getting this level of detail. There was the preparation so that when the dome was rolled back, there might be little or no hindrance in the application direct to the various crafts, flying crafts, UFOs, UAP, that were to be impelled through space. Got it? They're going through space. Whether in the radius of the visioning of the one eye, as it might be called, or whether directed underwater or under other elements or through other elements, underground. He mentions later they go through mountains. The preparation of this stone was in the hands only of the initiates of the time, and the entity was among those that directed the influences. Hastings was one of the initiates that directed the influences of the radiation that arose in the form of the rays that were invisible to the eye but acted upon the stones themselves as they set the motivating forces. The aircraft were lifted by the gases of the period, and whether guiding the pleasure vehicles that might pass along close to the Earth. You need an Atlantean taxi? I'm going to fly one right by you. Mm-hmm. Or what would be termed the crafts under the water. These then were impelled by the concentrating of the rays from the stone that was centered in the middle of the power station, the powerhouse, the TUAOI power station, as would be termed in the present. It's a power station. In the active forces of these, the entity brought destructive forces by setting up in various portions of the land the character that was to act as producing the powers in various forms for activities for people in cities and towns and countries surrounding same in Poseidia. These forces, not intentionally, were tuned too high and brought the second period of destructive forces to the people in the Atlantean land and broke up the land into the isles that later would become the periods when further destructive forces would be brought to the land. That's a major TUAOI accident that split Atlantis and starts on this course of this incredible apotheum overflow that we get from the TUAOI destruction. This figure, Hastings, was right in the heart of all of it. And so when he disappears with Cayce into Arizona and they go into this special mine, the Queen's mine, to get a particular type of stone, this particular type of true lapis, so that they can attune Hastings to his Atlantean past, we're getting a big hint about what the TUAOI stone was all about and what that technological marvel of the Atlanteans is and how it's being reconstructed. And here Hastings is involved in reconstructing it. After all, he's the engineering whiz. The question is, what happened to Hastings? What happened to his work? That's what we'll get into next, but we're going to take your questions. And so, Miss Olivia, take it away.
Okay, where do I want to start? Starting to the headdress, Najat Madri says, a researcher on YouTube that talks about India's artifacts says there's a Hindu statue similar to the Spanish statue. He claims the headdress is some form of wireless communication. A lot of people in the chat were suggesting that.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Or even a protection
device. Send me his name or her name to admin@darkjournalist.com and I'll check it out.
Okay. Donald's channel says, the area between Tucson and Nogales, is it Nogales? Mm-hmm. Is resplendent, one of my favorite words, with mysterious things, disappearances, hauntings. The Copper Queen Hotel is supposed to be haunted. And Quantum Paradox says, in Sedona, Arizona, there are 8 ley lines connecting together. It's one of the highest energy points on all of Earth.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Well, you always hear this stuff about Sedona as the power spot. There's a reason for that. And it's interesting because when Cayce talks about the appearance of humanity, he talks about atoms showing up in 5 places at once. And it's very interesting because one of the places is South America, one of the places is Atlantis, but one of the places is the western portion of the United States. And certain aspects in that plateau there, the famous four corners, apparently have been there and above water for much longer than other places on Earth. So therefore, it holds that whole ancient experience. And it's not just a place where a great civilization arose and then was destroyed and then went underwater. This thing is still, that platform above. And it's very interesting because if you get into Bisbee's history, there's a lot of celebrities who spend time and invest there. It's a very interesting place anyway. But it has this overhang of kind of poltergeist type activity. And all of those major haunting shows, when they're tracking down these different ghost things, they all end up in Bisbee. So it's basically, it reminds me of like very high voltage when seen from an esoteric point of view. But something about the copper and the lapis mines feed off a gigantic energy signature. And if we think about the Atlanteans mining there, then we start to get a hint of what's going on there. When I read about the tonnage of copper that they pulled out of that mine before it became deactivated, it was over, I can't even remember how much. I think it was 8 billion tons. So, we're talking about one of the biggest copper deposits in the whole entire world. Probably the only other place where they could get something that big in terms of lapis is that incredible mine series in Afghanistan. But there's a reason why lapis is the interface, why it is Ra, the sun god, why it is used by the Egyptians for Tutankhamun's headdress and funeral mask, and why it's used in very specific ways to indicate the third eye. And here's Cayce saying, here's your hint. Lapis. True lapis. Go for it.
Daryl Dothero. So 2-eye stones not only can bring complete apocalyptic destruction, but also a means of communication. Does Edward Lee Skeldon's Coral Castle in South Florida with hints of levitating stones have anything to do with Atlantis?
Well, it's very interesting because he took it to that place in the hot zone. So obviously there was a reason why he wanted to go there to build it. The other is that he got around structures and where there were large amounts of granite. So his story, he definitely tapped into. He knew what the Egyptians were about, and he was using that setup there. Unfortunately, we still have his castle, but nobody really quite understands what was going on there. Go ahead.
Jen Passavant, the ginormous stone that DJ showed near the beginning of the show is known as the Eilat stone, or King Solomon stone, which is made up of azurite, malachite, turquoise, and chrysocolla. David Tremina says, DJ, has anyone brought some lapis into the Queen's Chamber of the Great Pyramid?
Well, that's a great question. That's a fantastic question. A number of people, Manly P. Hall did his own ritual in the Great Pyramid. But we also know Aleister Crowley did his.
Do we know what Manly P. did?
No, but he came out of there convinced of what his purpose was. And I think what happens is there's a transformation there. So you have the physical structure to deal with, but the physical structure, once you're in the field of that pyramid, you're changed. So just like when you're in the presence of Notre Dame or something else along this line, the standing stones, Stonehenge, all these other places, they are, because of what they represent, they're already enacting changes in you. And this is what the archaeoastronomy is all about. This is what the ancients knew, and that's where that entire world grid comes from. But remember, the original world grid piece comes out of the Amelius group. They set it up as, the means of the interpenetrability of the spiritual world with the physical world. So when you get that same network used by the Belial group, you get this incredible dominance that apparently went on for years. And remember, the story is that the Belial group wins. They beat everybody, but the big prize at the end of it is Atlantis goes down, because the way that they've done it is they've abused this TUAOI stone, and either through accident or through destruction, it takes them out. Yes.
Johann Wolf, why wouldn't Blavatsky or Steiner ever mention crystals in context with Atlantis?
Well, they did. They certainly did. And what's interesting is what Steiner tries to give us is something that also comes up in the Cayce work, is that there's something about the power source that the Atlanteans use that's plant-oriented and comes from the life of the seed of a plant. So he's hinting at a power source there. Theosophy and anthroposophy give so much out, but they're also very mindful of the fact that, they see World War I and World War II coming, and they know if they put anything out there that these powerful nations will pick up on it. And, it's one of the reasons why Keely's technology goes underground, because Besant and Theosophy, after he dies, they say, well, look, they're going to use this stuff to bomb each other out of existence. So we're not going to be the ones to put it out. Humanity's not ready for it. And then there's the repression of technology that's been developed, on the government side. And that's a totally different type of suppression. So, you have these balances that go on when the government is holding back free energy, that kind of thing. It's so the power oligarchy can maintain their control. It goes back to the JP Morgan story, and it's quite fascinating because when Tesla comes back to Morgan and says, look, not only can you beam communications wirelessly, I can show you how to beam energy wirelessly. Nobody's going to have to pay for it. And they figure out, oh, we can't meter this, get this guy out of here, and get his name out of the history books and everything. And we have to remember this as well, which is Tesla, after, his association with Morgan, we're only lucky that he's rediscovered after his death, because he really, aside from some newspaper articles and things like that, he's taken out of the picture, and he's put on a very low awareness place in terms of how people would discover it. So that, when you're in the 1950s and 1960s, they're starting to remember that there was this guy back there who had a totally different approach to energy, because they're starting to see, the oil companies are dominating our lives. And so power becomes a big kind of geopolitical force in all of this. And here's Cayce saying, yes, it was physically the big, terrible, mighty crystal, but its actual purpose was as spiritual interface. So he's giving us hints again here about what this is all about. Yes.
Johann Wolf has some great quotes from Steiner about Atlantis, and I'm wondering if I should share them.
Share one.
Okay, well, I combined them all. Okay, so Johann Wolf says, our Atlantean ancestors differed more from the men of today than may be imagined by anyone who is wholly limited to the world of sense for his knowledge. They lived in a state of dull clairvoyance. They did not see things materially as we see them today, but in supersensible images. The ancient Atlanteans did not see external objects as we do today, but with sharply defined contours, they saw them rather surrounded by an aura.
Oh, fascinating. Yes. I remember there's a Cayce reading where he says, you have to understand this, that in that period of the Rata period, 10,000 BC, that the average ancient Egyptian was aware of things 10 miles above him. So your awareness stretched out totally differently in that time period for some reason. we became more hardened in our evolutionary track for other reasons, but we also lost that connection on a nature level. I'm going to read an interesting side note about Tesla and Edison and Cayce, and then we're going to get back to your questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X-Series 191. It's Atlantis, Arizona, Lapis Cayce TUAOI FireStone mystery. Mitchell Hastings, maybe one of the key missing links, often overlooked. Well, not tonight, as it were. This comes out of Sidney Kirkpatrick's biography of Cayce from, I think this book's from 20 years ago. In one particularly fascinating exchange between Cayce and Hastings, the source would describe the physical universe as consisting of mind, matter, and energy, which were all said to be various forms of electrical vibration. Now, this is the part that gets us into some strange territory. At the time of the meeting, it was believed that Cayce's voice could not be recorded, that his trance voice somehow did not fall within the range of Edison's equipment. Edison was trying to record Cayce's reading that he gave of him. The meeting between Edison and Cayce presumably took place at one of the classrooms in Bowling Green Business School and was arranged through Joe Dickey. No doubt Dickey escorted Edison into the classroom, where Edison reportedly witnessed a reading and then attempted to record Cayce's voice using a prototype wire recorder. Edison was unable to record Cayce's voice because each time he placed the speaking tube over the psychic's mouth, the recording would abruptly terminate. The reading would abruptly terminate. This is an interesting thing. During one of these readings that Cayce had given earlier, a doctor had passed a paper over his body to an aide on the other side. And Cayce went into a complete coma for 24 hours. So there's something about Cayce leaving his body that he's still connected to it. And if he were to be interrupted, if that connection were to be interrupted, the transmission stops. So he's kind of a radio receiver himself without any equipment. So Edison was not able to do this. Now, it's interesting because later Hastings will be able to record him, probably because he's using a room mic. One of the other things I find interesting about this is there's another story about that same series of doctors coming in, and he's again talking to this aide over Cayce's body, and he says, up, 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 meaning the chair on the other side, and Cayce's body starts levitating off the table. So Cayce's living in a different magnetic reality than anything that we're used to. But Cayce's so suggestible when he's in that state that his body will do anything that he's instructed to do. I'm sure if they said fly over this building and come back, he could have done it. Yes.
Amazing. David Termina. DJ, Hastings' bio says he worked in early radar. Do you think he had a relationship with Vannevar Bush and the UFO file?
Well, I think he's at Harvard. His dad's connected. His dad is a famous architect in Philadelphia. They're connected. His family's connected with the Zentgraffs, who do have all of these government associations, but are very close with the Cayces. So you're getting into very deep, deep connections, including Franklin D. Roosevelt. So, yes, the answer there is there's definitely some kind of hardcore crossover with Hastings. The question is, Hastings, when you read about his life in the 60s and things like that, the people who run these radio stations are like, look, this guy's does seances every other night. We're doing business meetings. We find out, well, he's in a spiritual meeting doing a seance. And then something happens to Hastings in 1967. He has some kind of a brain issue where they do a brain operation. And then he comes back and he tries to run his businesses and things. It's very, very unusual because there's a DJ who was kind of popular at one of the Boston stations, BCN, who's writing this kind of memoir. And he talks about Hastings, and he says everyone knew Hastings was like living on another planet. But after the brain operation, he would be in his room or in his office, and he would be talking, holding full conversations with something else, and nobody could see it. And they were like, did his brain operation make him crazy? I wonder exactly what was going on there with Hastings. So I think there's a lot to be uncovered. Yes.
Man, that's fascinating. Nanette Christ, I knew, back to Egypt for a second.
Yeah.
I knew an ARE elder who wore a lapis ankh to the king's chamber, and my Egyptologist friend had to pull it off when he screamed as it burned a hole in his chest.
Whoa.
And Sandra Corcoran, the Japanese did a long radar study in the Queen's chamber and found behind one wall is a chamber the size of an airport hangar.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of things that remain to be discovered in there. And when they had people like Hawass in charge of it, you got to wonder how far the deep state aspect got their hands on this. Apparently, according to the Cayce work, there's an amazing safeguard built in so that you can't have, Zahi Hawass and his, corrupt minions on the Egyptian side blundering into the Hall of Records. But this goes into the archaeology wars that we cover on this. They wanted to get their hands on the Hall of Records. The question often is, is it basically the TUAOI stone? Is that the thing that they're most after? Remember, it's on record that the CIA placed agents inside of the ARE in 1964 to find out, and they were there for months, to find out everything that Cayce had said about the Hall of Records. So they were on their own mission to get their hands on this thing. And so that's hot zone territory, if you want hot zone territory. Yes.
Okay, 37 Mom wants to know, where did the stones get the name TUAOI? Did Cayce name it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He spelled it out. He said, this is how you spell it. And he went through each letter loudly, TUAOI. And I've done all of these kind of, checkbacks on what's going on there and research the name. And it's very odd because you'll find the name in the Pacific, and in New Zealand, certain tribes in New Zealand have this TUAOI name. But what I found coming out of the Atlantic aspect is it seems like what it meant is people. So if you have the TUAOI stone, it's the people of the stone, the TUAOI stone. And the people of that, stone, because the stone was the interface, it was the spiritual interface to the saintly realm. And so it's very interesting when we consider it, the tragedy of the TUAOI stone is what it was used for by the Belial group. And I think this gets into part of the problem that goes on with technology, which is we're seeing it right now. And we're in deep, deep trouble because, there's the whole thing about artificial intelligence, et cetera. But we know that they've had the artificial intelligence since the 1960s. They know what it can do. They know the types of changes that it will make. They've had almost, let's say at least 50 years on this. So yes, when you let something out to the public, there is, a certain amount of organic development that will happen, but they know the stages of how this hits. So for, there to be this hand-wringing about, on the government side, about, what will happen with AI? No, they already know. The industry leaders know what it's capable of, what it will do. That's the scary thing, which is I feel like the populace, this stuff is falling down on the populace, and the populace needs better tools, It needs better tools than X, where people just fight about Jeffrey Epstein. You have to go a lot deeper. You need something, a very special tool. You're in 2025 and these forces are converging. So you have got to, rediscover somewhere in those memory banks, in those lifetimes, there's knowledge about this. And so that's something that I think we do here in the ideas room, which is we're opening that subconscious piece. And it's interesting because, Steiner says something very fascinating about Atlantis in the future. He says, he's talking in 1924 here, and he says, people are going to be amazed at the things that happen and how fast they will happen. And they'll think, oh, all these incredible new discoveries, how amazing that this is going on. And they won't realize that they are rediscoveries from Atlantis that aren't new at all, but that the unconscious memory of the thing, of when it was already done, is coming back. So the amnesia is wearing off. And
I think there's a lot of that happening right now.
Yes. And so how do we deal with it? This becomes the question. What do you got?
Okay, so this I'm curious about. Extra XL says the TUAOI stone wasn't made of stone. Cayce says it was basically glass, synthetic.
It's crystal.
Okay.
Yes.
And Courtfile says, was the design and dark bluish color of the One World Trade Center building intended to look like the TUAOI stone?
Well, that's really interesting. I found it interesting that Hastings was on top of the Prudential Center, that's where he centered his radio station. So that's what that made me think of, because the Prudential Center in Boston has some of that as well. And isn't it interesting that we have that one of the only shots, or the only shot, of Cayce with Hastings is on top of the Empire State Building. So, he liked being high up. There's something interesting there. I think that what I didn't really get time to put into this presentation is that Hastings tried to develop a machine that could record the Akashic records and play them back. And the Akashic record, of course, is that, the skeins of time and space and everything that's taken place has a record, and that we get all these mystics who tap into the Akashic record. Well, he basically said to Cayce, can I build a machine to do this? And Cayce said, absolutely. Well, it's interesting because as he's talking about it, Cayce's like, don't be so hesitant. Like, you can build this, you can do this. And he says, and you'll be able to record it on to disc. Now, the only discs that they had around the time they're talking in 1934, supposedly, are records.
This is Star Trek.
Yeah, it really is.
Mr. Atos, right? that's all on disc.
You're a most agile man, Mr. Atos. Just how many of you are there? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 191. We're going around. We are flying around Atlantis, Arizona, Lapis, Cayce's TUAOI FireStone mystery. We're taking your questions here. I have a few more quotes I'm going to read as well, and we'll do about another 20 minutes with you. What do you got?
Free Weezy says, I went to the top of the Prudential Center to do some magic, and it worked.
Interesting. Did you see Mitchell Hastings' antenna up there?
I wonder what kind of spell it was. So Twilight says, could any of these stones/tools be useful in stopping the Earth from an upcoming swift pole shift?
Yeah, I'm inclined to say, how else would you survive? The TUAOI, the reason that the TUAOI stone, because the Atlanteans were so ingenious and still had their spiritual faculties intact, they developed a power grid system that ran the planet. So eventually, we know that they destroyed themselves with it, but that has to be the most advanced piece of technology ever. And so going back to what Steiner said, we have it in the memory there. And Steiner also said, in terms of, living much longer lives, because the Atlanteans could live to 5,000 years, that's in the memory, and there are programs that I've discovered, and I'm saying this a little bit premature from anything I've presented, But let's just say that the wrong people are studying that as well as the good people. So hopefully the good people get there first. Here's a little bit more. This is what's fascinating. Some of the key readings, again, that people go to on Cayce over and over again involve either Hastings or his parents. And they're very often at the Zentgraf house in Long Island. And you're going to find there are very strange connections there with FDR. So he starts to talk to Hastings and his parents in this reading. And the parents are sitting there and they're saying, in the next room is Mitchell. He's our son. We want him to have this great information. Tell us about the world of the future. And so Cayce really lays it on thick. And these are some of the reading statements that he's well known for. But it all comes, again, through this association. He says, soon there is to come into the world a body, one of our own number here. Think about that. That to many has been a representative of a sect or a thought, a philosophy, a group, yet one beloved of all men in all places, where the universality of God in the earth has been proclaimed, where the oneness of God is known and is consciously magnified in the activities of individuals. His name shall be John, and also the place where he met face to face. John Peniel. Now, you've got the whole pineal gland. The spelling's a little bit different, but then again, this is Gladys Davis, the stenographer, trying to figure out what he's saying. So she writes down P-E-N-I-E-L. Pineal. So it's the pineal gland, right? This guy's John Peniel. When and where is this to come? It's in the hearts and the minds of those that have set themselves in that position, that they become a channel through which spiritual, mental, material things become one in purpose and the desire of a physical body. So he starts talking about this. And then he says, in the earth coming up, the earth will be broken up in the western portions of America. The greater portion of Japan must go into the sea. The upper portion of Europe will be changed in the twinkling of an eye. Land will appear off the east coast of America. Land rising. Remember? How many times have we emphasized this? Land rising, and that is associated in the hot zone with Bimini rising. The Bimini Temple rising. There will be upheavals in the Arctic and in the Antarctic that will make for the eruption of volcanoes in the torrid area. There will be the shifting then of the poles. So where there has been a frigid or semi-tropical will become more tropical, and moss and fern will grow. As to times, as to seasons, as to places, alone is it given to those who have named the name, who bear the mark, and those of his calling in their bodies. To them it shall be given. So he's tying in, he's saying you'll know because you're in tune. You've got that fingerprint. Spiritually, you're tied in. That's how you'll know. But he's talking about massive earth changes, and people were taking them literally. In the books that would come out in the 60s and 70s would be like, destruction of California is coming right up. Cayce is indicating a trend here, that this whole thing, the earth changes aspect, is associated with it, and that we're in the change, just like Atlantis was in the change 10,500 years ago. So we're in that change, and there's no question that the shifts that are going on with the technology companies and the things that are trying to be accomplished, including the COVID op, are related to their knowledge of these things happening. So this is the knowledge in the sense that we need to take in. And deep in the mystery school sources, they've given it out. They've said, here's the warning. So, and they're giving tools for how to tap into that. That's the way that I read what's going on there. And I think the Hastings association with the TUAOI stone in Atlantis is the reason that Cayce is drawing so much whenever he's around and he's pulling in these incredible things, because there's the last destruction. Here's the upcoming destruction. And again, it's the same people reincarnating, coming back, and they're facing off against this Atlantean destiny. And what happens with it this time? Well, if nobody even knows that it's going on, it'll just happen anyway, right? And I think that's maybe what a lot of these readings are getting at. They're awakening the people. They're creating that foundation. And that is a foundation of awareness that is, it's very catchy. That is, it bounces off one person, bounces onto another person, another finds it in a book, another's watching a documentary, another hears about something. They're all starting to hook up and sync up. So there's some unconscious process that takes place there. Yes.
Josh R. says crystals have gotten denser with time, as we all have. Therefore, their powers have decreased. I'm wondering, as we are ascending now, remembering who we are crystals getting reactivated?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that... I don't think crystals become less effective with age. So maybe a good geologist could tell us that. But in terms of what they use them for, I think there are some interesting innovations in terms of crystals and how they're grown and where they're grown. As Steiner indicates that they're actually a conscious being of some kind, which might give us a hint about what we're dealing with. We're actually interacting with another type of being.
Let me chime in there for a second.
Yeah.
Okay, so, if we are, as many people think, coming out of the Kali Yuga, which is part of this awakening process, could the density of the planet and of our consciousness impact the crystal's potency? And we are now all rising together. Are the crystals getting reactivated as we are coming out of the Kali Yuga?
Oh, it's no question.
So it's not time itself, but it's density.
Yes.
And consciousness.
Yeah, I think that that's true. Well, it's interesting because if you study the mystery material, what you're going to find is that they suggest, Steiner's saying this battle that we're up against in the 21st century took place in 1840 when scientific materialism took over out of Germany and set everything up. And he says, it's funny when people are obsessed with the future, because everything that rolls out in the future is all set up in particular dates in the past. So when we're, contemplating some of these dates that have been given to us, I went through a list of those dates in the last episode. 1840, 1879 was apparently a date where the mystery schools were aware there was going to be a huge battle in heaven between the forces of Michael that were going to throw these dark forces down to earth, and that all of these schools were prepared for that. Well, that's pretty cosmic, but then again, Steiner's giving us dates there. He's rolling things out in time. Well, Cayce gives us another one. He says the Earth's position shifts in space in 1936, setting up all of these other things. So the shift has already been on for a long time. Once you get past, what was the testing period that Cayce indicated? 58 to 98. Have you ever looked into, or if you've watched this program, what we've looked into that happened on those dates, 1958, 1998, they're very, very interesting, especially 1958, because it's the International Geophysical Year. That's where they discover. That's when we have satellites. That's when they're measuring the ionosphere. There's very strange things that are happening in 58, including the discovery of the laser. So him pointing it out as saying, here you're in full kind of Atlantean rebirth. Now you're encountering the technology in full again. And here you go. Yes.
Rotten CryptoBit says, all there is mind, right? I mean, when it really comes down to it, You know what I mean? Rather than thinking of particles and matter, it's all mind. So therefore, it's all connected. It's all one. And so it moves in tandem.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? It's all it all plays out at that ultimate level where there's no time and there's no space.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly mind, body, and spirit are the factors. It's a triune of factors. And they have to be balanced off against each other. There's no question. That is the balance message that comes out of this work. Here's one out of the Cayce work. And it's interesting because it mentions Poseidia, which I think is important for us to understand what that is. So Cayce says, yes, we have the records here of this entity now known as 877. These experiences in that sojourn in the Earth environment in what is called Poseidia in Atlantis. In giving the interpretation of the records as we find them, it is well that there be given something of the background, the variations, that there is not confusion. For in giving the experience of an entity's sojourn in a period as remote as the early destructive influences in the land called Atlantis, or in Poseidia, there's often confusion in the interpretations of the records as to whether Poseidia was the land or Atlantis was the land. This is the fascinating thing. Poseidia was that piece in the hot zone. It was the most advanced piece. That's sort of the Amelius group. That's their stronghold. And there's 3 islands at that point. And the other, Arian and Og, those other 2, it's the Belial group that gets the upper hand. But the kind of major emanations, the reason we still have this area in the Bahamas that has this, unusual happenings, all the strange things, the compass is spinning, the incredible UFO sightings, the hot zone geopolitics, the ruins, everything else. And, they find aspects like this in Spain, off the coast of Spain. And they recently just found these very unusual artifacts in southern Spain. And they don't know what culture they're related to. These, the Atlantean aspect of southern Spain and that whole area there, the Azores and everything else, that's all going to come out. But Poseidia is Bimini. That's the last piece. And there's something very special about that, which is why Cayce is saying, you're looking at this in Poseidia and Atlantis. And so over and over again, when he's talking about these people associated with Atlantis, he's saying you were Poseidian. There's something about that Law of One Amelius group there that's their kind of generation. That is their legacy, which is Poseidia was the highest point in Atlantis, and it was overwhelmed by the Belial group. But apparently, even after Atlantis went down, there was a section there of Bimini that was larger than what it is now. And that was kind of the final holdout of that Poseidian group. And I think that this whole piece about the Poseidian temple rising and it having the Hall of Records within it, and that we've already seen, he predicted, you'll see it in 68 or 69 is starting to rise, and then they find the Bimini Road. We're already, that's 50 years ago, but it's, we're in the age, we're in the period of it, as it were. So it's part of this is about cultural awareness. And right now, I would say the cultural awareness around things like Atlantis is much lower than it should be. It should be on a higher level at this point. And I think there have been waves in the 70s and 80s. If you look back and you go to those periods, you'll see all these books and things related to it in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and into the 90s, and then it drops off dramatically. And so the question is, it's kind of what Steiner was saying, there's this kind of new mystery era that comes in 100 years after 1920. So that's the period that we're in. The question is, do we catch the wave? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 191. This is the Atlantis, Arizona Lapis TUAOI FireStone mystery. There's so much more to say about Hastings, but what I will say is this: we'll take your last few questions and we'll bring it back around in a very interesting way in a Hot Zone episode that we have coming up. So you're going to have more on Hastings as we go. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for a newsletter. It's a free newsletter, and it keeps us in touch with all the incredible censorship that's going on. Stand up and be counted and find out about these incredible things we have coming up for you. Live events, documentaries, the CRAZE in the Hot Zone, Part 2, Hacking Atlantis. All of that is there in the newsletter, and it's waiting for you. And it's also the best way, because very often YouTube or any of these other platforms aren't really as reliable as they should be, but yet here we are. Mm-hmm. Go for it.
Tina Borich, ask DJ about the trumpet sounds around the world. I feel it's getting close.
I remember, I had a long conversation with Linda Moulton Howe. I'm trying to think. This is going back probably
pre-pandemic.
Yeah, probably 2019, something like that. And, what was great about Linda on that is she just, from a strictly journalistic point of view, could go here, 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 and here. In Canada, it was happening. On the West Coast, it was happening. In Europe, it was happening. Something very, very strange about that. And yet think about the whole piece about the music of the spheres, or what might be going on in relation to that. Now, there were also these incredible booms that were going on at the same time. And you don't hear as much about them anymore. And yet I feel like major, major things went down in terms of what was going on in terms of construction underground. And it's funny because, I've talked to people who've seen some of those things underground, the bases and things. And when you go down there, like, we would be shocked beyond belief. This isn't something that Doge is going to show us. There are malls, housing complexes. It's an entire world underground because they've been building that continuity of government infrastructure since the 1940s.
Right, you don't even have to believe in like Morlocks. There are actual people down there.
Oh yeah,
living their lives.
And I think that, I'm glad you mentioned that, because the time machine, I think the H.G. Wells story is very relevant for this period. Yeah, what do you got?
Okay, so getting back to the stone.
Yeah.
Denise Bilby says, wasn't lapis one of the Levite priests' breastplate stones? Josh
Yes.
R. says, lapis was on Lucifer's breastplate, yes. And T. Tuberider 1 says, St. Hildegard von Bingen, one of my favorite people, says, in the Book of Gemstones, through these stones both good and evil can be done. This splendor was what filled Lucifer with pride. He exalted himself by virtue of the beauty of the stones which was in him.
Well, it's interesting too, because if you look at Steiner's work, he does the whole Lucifer-Ahriman split, where Ahriman is what we traditionally know as Satan, and Lucifer is kind of this in-between character who helps humanity progress in some ways, but you have to be careful because his ultimate goal is to take humanity off the earth into these thought realms, So I think there's a lot there to be opened up. One thing I will say is that, the Urim and Thummim becomes the interface in the Bible for the high priest getting the spiritual messages to convey to the people in Deuteronomy. And that's very much like the Two-Eyed Stone story in Atlantis. But in that case, the way that Cayce discusses it, they're female priestesses who are trained to do this and receive the information from the stone. And this is interesting because if you look at Steiner's work around Atlantis, he will say that women discovered memory earlier than men. For some reason, in the evolutionary role of these things, we got women having memory first and men developing it later. So that might have been part of the reason for why these were priestesses, or there might be another reason. You know, the interface spiritually was correct. But in the Bible story, they need that. So that is very much, you put on the breastplate and you communicate with God through the stones, right? And then there is a story there where, you know, somebody takes it and tries to offer strange fire on the altar, and they're both struck down. You know, it reminds me of the Ark of the Covenant stories. They're references to technology, but it's not just technology. Again, it has that spiritual interface aspect to it. So if you're dealing with the Ark of the Covenant, you know, remember, in some cases, when people try to steal the Ark of the Covenant, it would take out an entire army. So it's obviously, you know, that's an apotheum atomic, you know, it's beyond a nuclear kind of tool. And it's interesting because in the Bible, they're like, oh yeah, and this is what it was designed by. It was, you know, it had insulated, you know, gold on the outside. I mean, they give you the entire description of the thing. So when Cayce says that in the Hall of Records, the construction of the TUAOI stone network is in there, and that starts to give you a reason to understand what the intelligence agencies are doing, trying to get into, with these archaeological wars, those esoteric secrets, because they want the advantage, you know. Hitler, when he went into Austria, what was the advantage he was looking for? He was looking for the power item. He was looking for the sword that pierced the side of Christ. It was supposed to be on display in a museum there. That's the first thing that he went and got after the Anschluss, when the Germans took over Austria. He goes into that museum and he's like, I've got the sword that pierced Jesus' side. So the,
what power is that supposed to have, the Spear of Destiny?
Well, you've got, you have a few references to what these things can do, but obviously, if you're coming from the negative side of this, the sword that pierces Christ's side is, you know, kind of your black magic.
So is it
wand.
supposed to make you invincible in battle? Basically, I would assume.
I think it is, again, it's like the enhancing of your purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because the Philosopher's Stone, Cagliostro, you know, tries to teach the Philosopher's Stone to his students. And Steiner says that the Philosopher's Stone had the absolute knowledge embedded in it that you would live 5,527 years. That's what he was trying to teach them. And that death would not become even a particularly memorable or traumatic experience. And I mean, we all know what happens to Cagliostro, and there's a great story there, and we're going to do an episode on Cagliostro coming up.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a number of these sacred objects, you know, remember, if something, even a handkerchief, is blessed by a saint, it has these incredible properties. And those things are real. It's energetic transfer of the highest possible level. So we can start to understand what the TUAOI stone is about. When they prepare these priestesses, they interact with the TUAOI stone. They interact then with the outer spheres of the saintly realm. That's what that real essence of the technology is all about. So it's interesting just to draw it all back to our Hastings Cayce story, because here is Hastings, who is actually drawn into using the dark side of the TUAOI stone when he's in Atlantis. And it's Cayce's son, Edgar Evans, who was back there as one of the scientists drawing him in to use it on the negative. And here he is coming back, and it's Cayce who's assisting him at a pretty young age, 23, to go back to where the Atlanteans mined this and sort of reboot that whole TUAOI Lapis experience. That's what's fascinating, and it's interesting to me because in all of Cayce's life, even though he has these incredible apparitions, including the figure in a turban that shows up and, does all these unusual things, but also the fact that he sees discarnates, the fact that he sees auras and all the rest of it, there is nothing in that Cayce canon that matches the 1 month that he takes off to Arizona and goes with Hastings. During that period of time, when he sees his own mother, who's recently passed away, she hands him what? A silver dollar. And the silver dollar, he brings back with him. It's not just an illusion. And he shows it to his family. And, Hewlin Cayce is always a skeptical kid. And he takes it and he calls up the FBI and he says, hey, I've got a silver dollar here. It doesn't have the mark. And the FBI raids him.
Of course.
Takes the silver coin without the mark, which was manifested by Cayce's mother in the afterworld. And they never hear from them again. Now, it's very interesting because the FBI has that object in their archives. The Cayce Institute, the ARE, is perfectly within their rights to go demand from the FBI, can we have that back? And they should. But beyond all that, it's a manifested piece. And so when you think about that and you think about the various kind of field of mirages that they go into when they head down to the Bisbee mine, and then they go to Nogales and they do even more of bringing up these stones, and then they bring them back. What's interesting is that Cayce goes back to Virginia Beach. But what does Hastings do? Hastings hangs out for a month. What is Hastings doing? Hastings is a great mystery, I think, in all this. I think we're going to learn that his experiments carried on through his life, and somebody in his family or somebody in that realm of associations has that work that he was doing and didn't feel like the world was ready for. And I think with that, Miss Olivia, we're going to take the last question. What do you got?
Well, I just want to say, Audra Warless says, the Spear of Destiny, also known as the Holy Lance, had the power to warp reality, regeneration, and to conquer the world. And Johann Wolf says, did you know that Trump had a solid gold replica of the Ark of the Covenant
Yes.
at Mar-a-Lago?
Oh, yeah. Well, Trump's not missing much on this. It's interesting because someone told me that Stephen Greer in an interview was talking about it and said, well, Trump's uncle didn't share anything with him, No, Trump's uncle, who, had been trained by Vannevar Bush, that's something we put on the record, that was his protege. And Vannevar Bush was in charge of the UFO file. There's no question that John Trump knew all about the UFO file and also the Tesla
Can I just
information.
make the point here?
Yeah.
Nobody ever talked about John Trump before you.
Oh, no, absolutely.
So, everybody talking about him now, it's because of you.
Well, we put out Tesla Trump in the time capsule in 2018, I think. And it's not that people didn't know there wasn't a guy named John Trump that went to the Nikola Tesla thing. Nobody had connected it with the UFO file or done the deep research in the back. But what's great about that is there's these very academic books now. One of them is about Tesla and the war and stuff. And they're using all of the X series stuff that we've done, all the research on it. They don't credit the research, but there it is right in the middle of their mainstream academic book. How fascinating. But what's interesting to me is that, of course, the reason that Trump brings up his uncle, Uncle John, he told me so much. That's him saying, I know all about the UFO file. And part of the, battle that's gone on there, it's not to make Trump a saint that he knows everything or is this super wizard. I'm saying that those people in the deep state dealing with Trump, they don't want to deal with a president who knows about the UFO file or knows through Roy Cohn, who was Trump's political mentor, where the deep state bodies are buried. They'd much rather have, Gavin Newsom. So they don't want somebody on their level. And it's, you know, you can easily say with somebody like Trump, you know, you like him or hate him or whatever. There's no doubt that it's a gigantic historic anomaly that his dad, you know, his uncle, John, is the mentor, was being mentored by Vannevar Bush at MIT, who was the dean of MIT. And that it's through Vannevar Bush that he goes and reviews all of the advanced work of Nikola Tesla when he dies. I mean, that, you know, there's no way the uncle didn't tell Trump. So this is one of the great pieces of history that we're in the middle of. And Tesla, Trump, and the time capsule, the reason that episode holds is, you know, we've added things to it over the years in other episodes, but that the whole setup is there in it. And, you know, they had a whole TV show. This is a funny story, and I'll just relate this real quickly. But the History Channel was calling me up, and, you know, I said, well, you know, it's the Tesla, Trump, and the time capsule thing. And they were like, give us all the details and all the rest of it. We want you to do the show. We want to work with you on this. And they seem like very serious people. And they literally used a vacuum cleaner to suck every idea. And then they had the worst, like, I don't know where they got this research team, or it wasn't even like, you know, they just got these lugheads around to do this thing called the Tesla Files, which was a bastardization of Tesla, Trump, and the time capsule. And it was terrible. So, and this is part of the problem with TV. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying when I started with this. The reason that you need alternative media in the first place is that mainstream media is corrupt. But if you have an alternative media that starts acting in the same corrupt fashion, you're going to need another, you know, you've got paid media 1 and paid media 2. You're going to need to go around the whole podcast thing and get to the heart of it. And that a lot of that goes to the people watching, that they want something potent, that they don't want to be played off against each other, that they don't want people doing product placements, you know, for everything. And, you know, so it's that kind of manipulation that makes something like dark journalism very important in this period of time. So, you know, for me, I think that we should get all kinds of things, and some things should be entertaining and just, you know, blown off or whatever. But I think when it comes to what was set up as independent media, you know, you're getting people rolled out there who are from TikTok or whatever, and they have all these producers and money behind them. I remember, you know, Hawk Tua, right? You know, they put millions of dollars behind her and then put her out there with a meme coin, crashed the meme coin, collected millions of dollars and took off. You know, that's the environment that you're in. So you need potent, very potent work. That's why, you know, I work in the stuff that I do, even if it's in its circle, it is the most potent work. And the most potent guests, the most potent stuff. That's what is necessary right now. So that's why I can easily, you know, recommend the work of like Chi-Ji Young, you know, for example. You know, this is what people like Gigi, like this show, this is what we want to do. We want to bring forward something that is potent, that you can use, that isn't manipulated, and that doesn't fall into paid 1 or paid 2. It's something else. And I think it's great that people get paid. By the way, I'm very in favor of money. I have no problem with it at all. But when it becomes just the manipulation tool in the space, I'll give you an example, because I get all these things all the time, because I get the inside track on marketing for everything. There's a track for people who produce videos on X in order to get more views so that they can cash out at the end of the month. And it's to place something intentionally wrong in your tweet. So you say World War I started in 1920 or something like that. And then everyone in the comments corrects you. And that's interaction. So it boosts the numbers for the algorithm. That's how sleazy the tactics are in the whole thing. It doesn't have anything to do with anything. And, you know, that's one of the most mild forms of it. You know, the whole hiring bots to fight with people around particular topics. And they've done it, you know, and incredibly so with the UFO file aspect and the things that we brought out about counterintelligence agents or whatever. People have done experiments when they just mention in a Reddit thread, well, Lou Elizondo is a counterintelligence agent, so therefore what he's saying might be suspect, and then all these bots show up rebutting you. Well, I've had that happen when I was doing the Chris Mellon investigations. So they're locked and loaded. They know what those systems are. But so a lot of what you see in social media interaction isn't real. So that's a big problem. So, the things that were going on this week when they were talking about Epstein and Israel and all this stuff, the back and forth around it, and the promotion in the middle of all that weirdness of the same people promoting Tate, the weird pimp. That's all a social media game. That's not real journalism. Candace Owens isn't real journalism. These are, they're games played by forces that are technologically enhancing artificially the environment of communication, and it's becoming harsher. So this is why it's so important to get behind the work that you feel has value and has potency. This is the thing. And to be able to call out the other stuff. Yeah.
And you say, what's the intention behind it? And ultimately, and this is where the corporate or half corporate media thing comes in, it's profit. It's really ultimately they're just doing this for money, for ego. And so we just have to ask of ourselves, we have to demand of ourselves that we're better than that, that we focus on truth.
Yeah, the
whole point of a truth movement is truth, not likes and clicks and attention and profit. It's to get to a better place societally.
Right. The culture has to move with it. That's the thing. Mm-hmm. And by the way, if any of those people, if they write a book or if they do a movie or whatever and they make lots of money, that's great, for their entertainment, whatever it happens to be. What I'm pointing out is the manipulation of that, so that it's no longer just, you're going out there doing your thing and making money. There's nothing wrong with making money. It's a fantastic goal for anyone doing the work that they do, and they should be well paid for it. But the point is, when you manipulate the entire environment, also you're using, and I am pointing out particular researchers, the forces behind those people. And, Thiel is in the middle of that mix. These are the people that are doing it, and they're playing for large, large stakes, billion-dollar stakes. So, this is a very different thing. And I've encountered them. I put that work on the record where they've exploited these things. And if they're planning, for example, on a $1 trillion cash cow for a UFO defense thing, you bet that they'll put the money into people like Elizondo, and that Mellon will get behind that because, he can draw on the other big bucks. So there's no question that it's there. And it's funny that Elizondo is coming up here because, that whole environment is right here at Harvard because of Avi Loeb and all those other people. That entire apparatus of launching a false UFO threat, you don't have to look very far if you live here. It's very, very close. I'm sure the people in D.C. feel the same way. And with that, Miss Olivia, your last question you got.
I'm asking everybody in the chat, should you go to see Lou on Monday? Should you attend?
Oh, I probably won't be there, but it's just, I would say that, somebody like that, people shouldn't, they really should be calling it out more than anything else and not going along with it respectfully. And I've always encouraged them when they were going to, when they were really saying all these things about me and the reporting I was doing on them, I was like, hey, let's have a gentleman's debate, come on the show and we'll do it. They were never up for that because those people, and I found this out really from talking with David Grush, the people, not so much about him, but about Mellon and Lou, those people are, they can't be asked straight questions. For example, when they go on Fox News or something, the first question out of the reporter's mouth, or News Nation, which is the worst, the first question out of their mouth should be, do you still work for the government? That's the first question. And they'll say, well, it's, prevarication. But the fact is, if they work for the government, then they are the government. So them railing against the government while being the government doesn't add up. If they're counterintelligence people who continue to be on the government payroll, what is it the government would pay them to do? It would pay them to do counterintelligence. That's what they're doing. So the whole UFO threat thing gets busted if you talk to dark journalists for more than 2 minutes. That was the problem with those people. And now, 5 years later, people, it is starting, people are looking at it and saying, oh yeah, why should I talk to counterintelligence CIA people? It's finally, that dam is breaking. You see how this works. And that is a painstaking process. But I can tell you, there's a huge manipulation in there, and the money that they're talking about is huge, but also the influence over society and the development of an emergency in a sky event to create emergency powers. We've put the evidence forward on this show, and I think in that sense, through the ideas room and everything else, a lot of people have become educated, and that's the goal here with everything that we do. So with that, Miss Olivia, I think we're super chatting.
Okay, all right. Basically, people do not want you to go. They think it's a waste of time and energy, and they want you to spend your energy on better things. I want to finish with Ray's story because Ray says, could this push people back to reading actual books? I think that we were just having this conversation that the infotainment world, everybody has gobbled up so much information that they're going to have to graduate to actual getting back to books because everybody just keeps rehashing the same thing, and we're not really getting into the deeper, potent information.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
That has to be the inevitable next step. Okay, so
well, now they're doing the a la carte burrito treatment, right? So they've got somebody like Elizondo, and he wants to talk about ancient man, and so they want to roll everything. And he's psychic too. Did you know that? Lou is psychic. He's a remote viewer. He's experienced God, a saint at the bottom of his bed. Let's see, what else has he done? So, when you get into this, suddenly it's a whole, they tried with one thing, his UFO threat thing didn't work. What else can you do with him? And that becomes the thing of it. And now he is acquiring Native American wisdom.
That bothers me more than anything
else.
No,
it does, yeah. And the TTSA, that whole thing, they had a program for extracting star stories from the Native Americans. That was run by Jim Semivan, who is a 25-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency. You want Hopi elders giving the CIA star seed inside stuff? I don't think so. So we have to, you need those ethical guardrails when you're dealing with this stuff. And, they could use anybody, even when I spotlight Lou or somebody like that. And that is a real, an incredible psyop, but they could have used anybody. It's not, it's not like he's some particular evil person that they want to do this with. They just needed somebody to fit their mold and put them out there. So I guess the thing that I want to point out to people is that those people are working. They're working. They're going to work, and the object is spin a counterintelligence narrative. That's what it is. So it could be, anybody. It could be the other guy who loves the egg or whatever, but it's the same job. So it's nothing personal. That's just the job that they have. And also remember this. I point this out often, but investigative journalism is adversarial journalism by its nature, because in order to get to the story, you have to do that. But it can never be personal, because then you've lost objectivity, so you stop reporting on it. So, but the reason it's adversarial is because, just like if you're investigating a CEO who's dumping nuclear waste in a river, you can't go and hang out with them and have dinner and stuff. And so that's kind of rule 101 of journalism. And so I think you need a lot of that in mind. And I think what's missing on the independent media side is there's no real rules of journalism. It's just, throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. And so there's a huge manipulation behind it. I think that's what we need to get at. And the best way to expose it, really, ultimately, is just by working with potent material. Because if you work with the potent stuff, that stuff will always seem ridiculous, by comparison. And even if a small group is calling it out, it ricochets everywhere. That's just the nature of the environment. And there have been times when even as a lone outpost, we've done things and it's had incredible repercussions. They've had to cancel programs over it. And it's not because of me, but it's when things get out, and when the observation is reached, when the awareness level ticks up. So that's something that we all do really well here in the Ideas Room. So I want to close off tonight's episode in the spirit of Cayce's work. And what he was saying was humanity was growing close to the things that had happened in Atlantis, and it was kind of facing off against itself. And that's what the 21st century is all about. So the question is, what are we going to do with that memory of that past as it comes back, as it resurfaces, and we rediscover that? That's real disclosure, in my opinion, far, far beyond the UFO question, which is certainly important. But in that Cayce spirit, that's something good for us to consider. And Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, fan funding?
Yes.
All right. A cult fan, Jake, Eurythmia's Fun, Larminine Bay, Les Scott, Barry7676, Empire of Light, The Bikini Truther, Jessica Rodriguez, Old Dirty Shinobi, Jay Parsons, Audra Warless, Roosevelt Media News, C.A. Beverforden, Descat Brock, Sherry Brown, Robert Scott, Terry Doherty, Conrad, Sick of the BS, E.M., Quantum Paradox, Debbie McAdoo, Tommy Van Gompel, Joe Werner, Justin Case 008, Brian Whitaker, Mike Brosnahan, Josie Fiorda Seville, and Sun Hero, and John Matthews. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Wow, it's incredible. And we really appreciate it. And to all our subscribers, thank you. We couldn't do what we do without you. And we'll continue to bring you these deep reports. And we have some great things coming up for you. And of course, we're watching closely for this D-Class panel and the things that they put out in relation to some of the things that we're tracking around the UFO file, the JFK assassination, and some of the real deep secrets that can be opened up with certain types of information coming out, especially the aerospace involvement in these areas and what's going on there. So far beyond what we're seeing as regular headlines. And we do all that because of you. I wanted to say, I mentioned the Mitchell Hastings redheaded strange apparition who shows up and then he ends up meeting her and marrying her. Here's Cayce's talking in a letter to him about the same woman and saying, when I left you at Douglas, there was a young lady sitting in the seat just opposite me, not more than 19 or 20 years old. And, but she kept casting many glances in my direction. Just before we got to El Paso, she asked me if she had not seen me in Bisbee the day before. Said she thought she saw me and two other men and the mining engineer of the copper mine there. So I told her, yes, she was correct. Then she told me she was the daughter of the operating engineer in the mine. I asked her about the azurite, and she told me that if we really wanted other samples, she was very sure that if there was such a thing to be had at all, she'd be very glad to get it for us. Her name was Miss Olmsted. Whether it was Agnes or Annie, I forget. But should you decide to want other samples, I would advise the next time you go to Bisbee that you get in touch with the operating engineer. What do you think of that for a coincidence? So there is the apparition of Hastings' wife giving all this information to Cayce before Hastings meets her. Try that on for size. We know we're in the apotheum zone when you get there. What do you think of that?
You know, my immediate reaction was expect a miracle.
Oh, wow.
Which that's not where my mind normally goes. And that maybe we are in a new space where we can, if we believe it, it's possible, we can start manifesting synchronistic, destined, exciting, juicy
Absolutely. You know, I went back and I watched a documentary on Catherine Kuhlman. Catherine Kuhlman was the 60s and the 70s, you know, kind of evangelistic preacher. She had a couple of interesting things in her background I was studying, but one of the things she said was, and she was popular for, was, "I believe in miracles." So you've got it.
Oh, wow. I mean, you know, think about all the negative things you think every day and sort of turning it into that instead as your mantra.
No question.
Man, what could happen, not just to ourselves individually, but to the planet? I mean, really, I keep asking myself, like, you know, I'm part of the problem because I'm thinking negatively, you know?
True, because of the environment. Yeah, and that's interesting because Cayce would say thoughts are things, and that's, you know, mind is the builder. So let's keep that in mind, given the environment that we're in. I'll do a couple of shout outs here before we go. Let's see. Dorothy Papineau, it's good to see you. See, Olivia's funny. You're already getting a great reaction out there. Let's see. Philip Blair, and great job. Congratulations. Nicely done, Miss Olivia. Astara, live in the wish fulfilled. Yes. Oh, absolutely. As if it already happened. Isn't it Neville Goddard? Something like that. That guy was unbelievable. And he hung out in the hot zone a lot. Let's see. What else we got? Corey Anderson. Rotten Crypto Bits. Here, I'm going to see what I can do here. Spontaneity is the bottom line. That's a good one. Spontaneous is important. Great show, Tina Borch. It's great to see you out there. Fantastic. Nicely said, Olivia. See, you got more. From thought, you can literally go and call orbs in the sky. Just try. I believe it. I believe in miracles. Manifest juiciness, John Matthews said. There he goes. Astara. Yes. Philip Blair. Elsid Barrett. Songs. From lots of generations of special forces before and after battle. Oh, isn't that interesting? Corey Anderson. Great show tonight. Thank you, Daniel and Olivia. Corey, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. And Jen Passivant. Azurite is known as Lapis Linguis, hence the confusion with lazuli. Yeah. I had a whole thing about what was being said there, but basically what you said agrees with what Cayce said. When they asked him to specify it, he said, it's the azurite. So we're on the right track. Super interesting show tonight, guys. Najat, it's great to see you out there. Fantastic. Jay Cameron, Scarlet Fire, I approve this message, indeed. Jessica Rodriguez, our voices are the keys and the tools we need to open up the worlds we want. That's a good point, which is saying the thing is a major, major breakthrough, bringing it through vocally. The other thing that's important and is stressed often by Cayce and others is writing things down. I think that this solidifies it. It comes out of the subconscious into the physical world, and that creates a symbiosis immediately. I remember when the election was happening a few years ago, and people had said to me, you know, I think I suggested just write to your congressperson about this or that thing that was going on. And they said, well, why? You know, they won't, it's a waste of time. And I said, well, it's the force, you see. When somebody sets an intention and writes something, there's a force with it. So whether you think it'll, they'll read it or not even doesn't make any difference. That's the thing, which is you've brought it there into the world. Yes, Neville was tapped in Barbados. Oh, that's where it was. Fascinating. Yeah. He was getting very high level information, no question. Johann Wolf, pronoia, a psychological or philosophical concept describing the belief that the universe or reality is conspiring in one's favor. There you go. I believe in miracles. Thanks, DJ and Miss Olivia. Okay. I say keep it moving. Exactly. Thank you, DJ and Olivia, Sun Hero. It's great to see you out there. Wow. John Boy, Elsid Barrett, calling all occupants. That's the Carpenter song. There's nothing better than that. Definitely a rewatch episode, says Jessica. Caritas Tarot, Lapis Lingus means blue tongue. Indeed. And I read that the Egyptian word for lapis meant of God. So when they had gold with lapis, that Ra was made of golden lapis. He is basically of God. DJ, any thoughts on the unground discoveries in Gene Hackman's New Mexico estate? It's hard to say. It's hard to say with any clarity what happened there, but the official account doesn't make any sense. So I wonder. I wonder a lot. Amazing job, guys. Sun Hero, thank you. Sundari Bliss. Sundari knows quite a bit about Atlantis. Great show. Thank you, DJ and Atlantis. And Olivia. Oh, I said Atlantis there.
Mm-hmm.
Remember Atlantis Octavia? That was Janet Atlantis's mother. And then Ghislaine Maxwell took the name Janet Atlantis to buy her house in Bedford, New Hampshire. Whoa, what a place to get arrested. CC, Energy Frequency, and Good Vibrations, DJ and Olivia. Wow, you can't get better than that. Everyone, thank you. It's been terrific. Going deep into the TUAOI stone, Mitchell Hastings, Cayce, and the FireStone mystery. And you can just feel we're getting somewhere deep with that. We'll be back with you next week. And that should be a very exciting show we have coming up for you, X Series 192. And have a fantastic weekend. It says end broadcast, but after all,
Never really ends.
And Debbie McAdoo? My son's name is Blue. Oh, how about that? Absolutely fascinating. That's great. Wow, great comments here at the end. I know Kate's watching out there. It's great to see a Golden Girl, Alley Cat, likewise. Freaking recruiter. I always get the questions at the end here. Smile more. Exactly. Boy, that's a good one. If only you believe in miracles. There you go. Catherine Kuhlman's calling your name. And yes, there is a show on Catherine Kuhlman, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, and some others coming up. So make no mistake about it. We will see you all next week, and have a fantastic weekend, everybody.
God bless.
And never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and could be again. Could be. We'll see. We'll see how it goes.